Great, well, morena koutou everyone. Welcome along to our briefing, 4th of September 2024. Agenda today includes community funding, review of the tree and vegetation policy, biodiversity work programme, public consent notices around development, and ECAN representation review. So first up is community funding workshop. We've got a couple of apologies today. Nicole is joining us online, and Lydia is an apology for the day, as is Shane. I think that accounts. I haven't heard from Elizabeth. So I'll hand over to staff. Thank you for the paper and the reading ahead of time, and yeah, welcome to take us through it now. Thank you.
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Nicola Sutton tōku ingoa. I'm the head of Community Insights and Policy, and also sitting with me today is Claire Quirk, who is head of Community and Economic Development, and the Community Funding Programme sits under the Community and Economic Development team. You may recall that on the 7th of August we workshopped some key changes to the community funding program, and the changes are to implement what was agreed for the community funding program by Council in November last year, and also through LTP decisions in May this year. So next week at the council meeting, council will formally receive a report with recommendations for changes to the policy, the terms of reference for the councillor-led assessment panel, and some fund-specific changes as well. At the workshop on the 7th of August, some councillors indicated they needed time to understand the community funding program in more detail and the changes being made to it. So the purpose of the session this morning is to provide you with a full view of the matters that will be in the report coming to you, and it's my hope that the information in the paper before you provides the clarity that's sought and will enable you to make good strategic decisions. So this morning we're going to have time to work through any matters you need clarification on or which you would like to discuss further. Just as a very brief introduction, the key recommendations that will be coming in the report next week include approval of a revised community funding policy, which sets out to clearly show Council's purpose for the community funding program and the parameters it wants to set for who, what and how it funds. The policy also sets out its approach to assessment, payment and accountability. The next major item in the report is the terms of reference for the councillor-led assessment panel. This panel is pivotal. Sorry, Nicola, I'll just get you to stop. Can we just change the volume in the room? Just too loud, feeding back to the microphone. Right. Okay, is that better? Okay, fantastic. It was a wee bit disconcerting. So the next major item in the report is the terms of reference for the councillor-led assessment panel. Actually, that might work better. This panel is pivotal in the approach to funding. It will allow for more effective, transparent and strategic decision making. So the terms of reference give extra detail around the settings for the assessment panel which are contained in your policy. The paper before you also includes some updates on various funds and an indication of recommendations that are still to come in relation to several of those. So I'll now hand back to the Chair for questions and discussion.
Great, thank you for the overview and bringing the paper back to us. Councillors, have you got any views or comments on the paper as it's been presented? Grant.
Can I ask a fundamental question? Did we ever review whether we should actually do this at all when we change this? As a base idea? Isn't it a good opportunity when you change to say, should we be dishing out ratepayers' money at all? Was that considered?
In terms of, there was a paper brought to council number of months ago around community funds and around the desire to bring community funds together. So there was an opportunity for council to have open debate with that paper, and council supported bringing the funds together. So there has been a formal paper and there was an opportunity for councillors to discuss or to have give appropriate guidance.
my recollection is there's never been an explicit question to us as a set of governors saying, should we continue dishing out ratepayers' money on a monthly basis to a wide variety of community groups? I guess you could phrase it that way, that you had the opportunity to say yes or no, but is there any desire to have that discussion?
I think that's up to councillors, but the paper provided an opportunity for discussion, and as did the LTP. And I didn't hear that direction from councillors at any stage from the paper or at the LTP stage. So, and it's been endorsed at the LTP. So we have the recommendations and we're following through on those.
The reason I raise it is because it's largely turned into a school sports and trip funding exercise, isn't it? I mean, there's the vast majority of applications are now for school support, but not 100%, but the vast majority. And I'm just not sure that was what I was originally set up for.
It wasn't.
So, Granny, are you wanting to look at the terms of what funding is for, or what's the basis for the question?
If you ask my opinion, my opinion now is that it's time for a radical rethink and saying, is it the right thing to be dishing out community funds, ratepayers' funds for these issues? And I've come to the conclusion that actually, for the benefit it gives, we were better off to say, no, we don't do this at all. But that's only my personal view.
Sam, can I, as chair of the grants fund, can I chip in here? The grant, I agree with you that the ward discretionary funds have tended to be ones that funded school trips and things as well. But the grants fund itself does not. It funds a greater and bigger range of events throughout Selwyn, and of which the school funding is not in there. There might be some lease costs for use of buildings and things. There might be some sporting equipment occasionally, but there's certainly not, doesn't run like the ward discretionary fund does. It's a much bigger plethora of grants given to a great, deeper number of organisations.
Yeah, thanks for allowing the questions, and thank you for bringing this, make sure that this came back. I was one of the ones who I thought we really rushed it last time, and I'm really pleased to be back here. I do support this, and a couple of things I wanted to just raise is I think this is the radical rethink. I think this is the opportunity to actually get everything back out on the table, and actually gives us an opportunity to be restrained. You remember, this group is going to be made up of us, and we need to make sure that how it's constituted. We briefly discussed that the other day, but I think that it is going to be restrained. One of the things that I'm looking forward to this addressing, and I think it's the only way that we can do it, is to start looking at our community funds as a holistic, across the board thing. I'm sure Bob won't mind me saying we did the history fund, the heritage fund the other day. 15 of the 21 applications at that fund were from one area, and to get that disproportionality out of it, I think that this is the only way that we can do it, is by getting things considered out, and then we can go to the next step, which is saying we have funding. How do we make sure the right people are aware of the fund? I'm not just talking about that urban rural divide case for the description, which kind of makes sense too. And I'm not saying that it's wrong that the 15-21 spread. I'm saying that it was just really obvious. Major projects is that's another one. We believe our major projects are particular things, but we can sit around, we can talk about the major projects, the major events. Well, I guess there is a question coming. My question is, do you consider that it is a councillor or a council staff responsibility for the responsibility of community representation? And because that's linked to the community funds. In my view, so yeah, I'll leave the question open for that.
So you're talking
Sorry. You're talking about the 1 to 2 independent members on the assessment panel that would be nominated by the assessment panel. Is that what you're talking about, Phil?
I'm talking about the greater concept of community representation. Like, how do we get, for example, Melbourne has 14 different community groups, Rolleston has 1. Clearly that is disproportionate, doesn't line up with our community. Whose responsibility is to fix that? Is it Councillor or council staff?
You're talking about the residents groups.
I'm talking about any,
Right.
We can start with the residents groups.
Right.
Well, is that sort of like way bigger than the question about community funding?
It's kind of leading there, because maybe I should contextually what I'm trying to say is that if it's not council, maybe this is the group that also looks at that part of it too. So, like, looking at making sure that we have representation in the way that it needs to be done, making sure that it is a level that I'm not level playing field, because it's not a level playing field; it's an equitable playing field. And if the council staff believe that it is councillor responsibility, then perhaps challenging the community funding is the wrong thing to be doing, and maybe the status quo is better, because if it sits with councillors, then councillors should maybe be responsible for it. And that kind of, you're following my link there? No. Okay. Sorry. No. I understand. I don't know how to explain it again without just saying the same words.
Yeah, maybe it's just being it's not hearing it. That's right.
Are you asking if the group of the panel should have a broader brief than simply funding? I'm mindful that there are a varieties of ways that council support community. Are you is that the direction of travel?
Yeah, I guess it kind of is.
You're saying is that panel big enough? Does it cover enough?
I think it's big enough, but I think probably I think that's probably along the right lines to this. It's basically saying that the community funding and the community representation, they are linked in together. Hence the reason why we get a lot of funding going into our rural environment from the community funds, and and we need to make sure that it is balanced. I guess this is the forum that can start. So, yeah, I look at maybe it's not a question, maybe it's just a comment. Now that I think about it, maybe it's just me on a soapbox, but yeah, look, that's something that I'm aware of. Is that I'm wondering whether there's that divides there. Does that make any more sense? No. Okay. Well, maybe I'm happy to take it offline, but there is some areas here where I have some concerns, and if the representation is not right, then the funding won't be right.
So you're talking about the distribution of funds as they have existed currently, you don't think is fair, so this change enables a district look at funding.
Yes,
okay.
Yes, and I think that's what it does, but what it also needs to do is to go the step further and look at and ask the question, why are there 14 community groups in the Melbourne community and only 1 in the Rolleston ward? That's what it needs to do. So it needs to go to the next step and say, how do we make sure that the 12,000 people in, don't get me wrong, I don't think that Melbourne's got it wrong, I think that Melbourne's got it right. But how do we make sure that reflects through to work that we do to get a greater representation for the 30,000 people who live in Rolleston, and then 16,000 who live in Lincoln, and the 8,000 who live in Prevalent, to make sure that urban area is being serviced just as well as the and maybe this is the
population base.
And maybe some of that is that council's job. Like, I think one of the things we need to do is what is actually council's role in this, and so should council be telling the community how it should set itself up, or should it organically grow from within a community? And the reason why the rural areas have got that is because everyone identifies by their own township, and you ask someone where they live. If they live in Glentunnel, they're not going to say they live in Colgate. Yeah. Whereas if you live in Rolleston, you often say Rolleston unless you identify with a particular subdivision that you think everyone else is going to know. So, like, until the community itself self-identifies and differentiates itself, I'm not sure that we're the ones to drive that change.
I think that we have a responsibility to guide them because, and that may have worked in the past, Sam, where we had a much smaller community in places like Rossett. Now, a third of our population is here, and we need to make sure that they do get the representation that they need. And I think that maybe there's an area that we have some responsibilities of at a council level. Yes, you're right. Ultimately, it is the community who will decide their own shape and form, but we can guide them on the way. We can show them the route, the road. And I think that a group, if we're starting to go down the community funding line, maybe it's a natural extension for that is around that. Otherwise we're just going to keep on going. 14 communities in Melbourne are going to be supported at $250 per year, I think it is, and one community in Rolleston is going to be supported for $250 per year. But you take the break into population base, doesn't make any sense.
Okay, cool. Sharon?
Thank you, Phil, and sorry I struggled to follow your thread. I guess I just wanted to kind of bring this back to a little bit about how I responded to Grant the other day. This is what's being brought through as a result of paper was brought through, council endorsed pulling all of the funds together. We had the LTP that's been endorsed. This is an iteration of a new model, and remember, this is our first iteration, and this is trying to do things in a new way. There means that there is an opportunity to review this. Like many of the other things that we do in terms of here's our starting point for a different way of working, and there is nothing to say that in 6 or 12 months that this can't be reviewed again. Is this working well? Have we got this right? Is it in terms of equity across the district? Are we getting best bang for buck in terms, or is the community getting best bang for buck? So I'm just a wee bit concerned that we're at risk of going off on a completely different tangent when actually we've already got council resolutions that's bringing this to this point. And what you're talking about is a part of also a bigger conversation, and I just don't want what we're trying to do or trying to bring forward as a suggestion to get lost and find ourselves relitigating when it comes to the council paper. So it's a good opportunity here to have this discussion, but yeah.
I think that's true, and I think that also aligns with what Grant you were saying about the radical rethink. I think this is the radical rethink. But whoever is the governors of this organisation, we need to set the strategic direction. And I think that this is what I'm saying is that our strategic direction in this, when it comes to community funding, is wrong. And that's why I say it's fantastic that we're going down this model, looking at it in a district-wide model. But let's not forget the strategic thinking on the way. That's all we can do here. Is the strategy. That's where you want us to be thinking. You want us to be in the strategic space. Let us be in that strategic space. Let us have the conversation. That's my contribution towards that conversation. Thanks, Phil. Okay, I appreciate the time. Elizabeth.
Thank you. I agree with what I did catch Grant speaking about earlier. I think we do need to have a rethink about the funds and show restraint. And I did mention that during the LTP that I had concerns about people applying for the funds over and over again and the types of groups that we're seeing coming through and the reliance on the funds. I actually really think that we are in a situation where the ratepayers are expecting us to show that we are, showing some restraint with our spending, and I feel that this is an area that we should be looking at. So following on a little bit from what Phil was saying about being strategic here, I personally would like us to actually tighten up the requirements for people applying for funds. I don't support individuals applying for funds, and I feel that groups that are only delivering an outcome for 10 to 15 people but requiring thousands of dollars, that's a nice to have. I would really support a review of the terms and conditions for those applications, and I feel the scope of funding is too large. I really feel that we should actually really give this some serious thought. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Do you want to comment on any of that? I feel like we've focused a lot here on what the more discretionary funds might give out, and the community funding is far broader than that. So, do you want to just maybe give us a bit of an overview? Because it seems like a lot of the conversation has come down to the ward discretionary funds type conversation. Could you just talk us through each of the funding pools and pots and how that actually gets delivered, and just help us get our minds into the space of where this goes?
So I might also draw on a bit of expertise from Claire in this as well, but there's a number of pots that are quite big, and I think let's start with those because they give they cross a range of things, and I think it's useful to think about that. So one of them is the community fund. It's a fund that is focused on supporting community-led initiatives, so community doing things to enable the community, to provide wellbeing to the community, and it's about celebrations, it's about events, it's about opportunities to bring people together so they connect, it's about attracting visitors to the district, and so it has a strong focus on participation and engagement of people in things like arts, culture, sport, recreation, community history. That's where the community history fund sits. It focuses on things like younger populations, older populations, and multicultural communities and things like that. So that's quite a broad fund, and that is the one fund that is heard 4 times a year. So groups are able to apply for that throughout the year, and the assessment panel will receive information that shows how the fund is being spent by ward over the year, so it will enable strategic decisions to be made there. So that fund is 263,000 per annum at this particular point in time. Then there's the Natural Environment Fund. So some of you might have known it as the SNEF, and the purpose of that is to encourage and assist landowners, individuals, community groups and mana whenua to protect, restore and enhance the natural environment. And so that supports things like the council's goal around planting and increasing the biodiversity, the Indigenous biodiversity area, protecting ecologically vulnerable sites, and alongside that goes the runoff effect in terms of water quality improving because of the works being undertaken by community groups, and it supports the direction that the council's taking with its biodiversity strategy. I think what's really important to understand about a fund like this is that it enables council to achieve outcomes for its district that council could never do. You just don't have the manpower to do it and the resources. There's an enormous amount of voluntary effort go into the work that's carried out by community in this that brings back far more than is ever given out. So that fund in the LTP is approved at 225,000 per year. Then there is a predator-free fund, which is 50,000, and that is focused on reducing the predator animals across the district. And it goes alongside the Environment Fund in that it enables all of the planting and things to take place. It's pointless if you've got a whole bunch of things eating what's been planted and the diversity there as well. Then we have the Heritage Protection Fund. So council has a responsibility to protect the heritage items in the district, and in the district plan there are a large number of items and protected trees that are listed, and a requirement on those that are the owners of those items. They're not council, most of them are not owned by council, some of them are. So the purpose of this fund is to support landowners and item owners to maintain and protect those pieces of important heritage for the district. It is supporting the maintenance and enhancement of heritage items such as buildings, war memorials and other structures in sites of significance to Māori, and protected trees in the district plan. So that's 150,000 per year. That went up this year. It hadn't increased for well over a decade in the ability for it to protect heritage, as more items have been added on the district plan, had become quite out of whack there. There's the Student Tertiary Scholarships Fund, so you'll be quite well aware of that, and that is 36,000, and what that does is enable 12 students from the district to benefit with some support for tertiary education. So it's a way for council and the community to acknowledge excellence and to encourage our young people to aspire to excellence. I'll come back to this particular one. So
we didn't do a line-by-line itemisation.
There's the Ellesmere Reserves Board Reserve Fund, so that comes about through the income raised off a specific set of reserves, and that is for supporting the maintenance of reserves and sporting and recreation in the Ellesmere community. There's the Strategic Events Fund, so that's a new fund this year, and the purpose of that's around supporting and attracting major events that will enhance the economic and cultural and social benefits to the district. So we've got this fantastic range of facilities in the district. We've also got terrific reserves and parks as well, and it is about making sure that the district benefits from those things by being able to attract in some of the major events. So, for example, it might be the Masters Games. That is one of those major events that would be good to bring into the district, and the benefit being the return that it brings in terms of spend in district alongside other things. And that is both, it has a contestable and a non-contestable element. The assessment panel will be involved in both parts of it. The contestable element is the only one running this particular year. It's 58,000, and then the fund increases from there on to 180,000, moving up to 250 in year 5 of this long-term plan, and that is what will be needed in order to bring those bigger events to the district, so moving towards that level of competency. The Strategic Partnerships Fund, you will recall allocating those partnerships through the long-term plan process. So we have a number of partners across sport, youth and environment in particular. And what this new process does is it allows the assessment panel to set a much more strategic direction around strategic partnerships in the future. A lot of those have been ongoing year after year after year. And so the new approach allows the assessment panel through the council to set the direction it wants to go, and then to open up a contestable process to invite community to put in. So a much more fairer, transparent process, but also actually a much more strategic process as well. And there's 230,000 in that fund. The last of the contestable funds that I want to talk to is the Individual and Teams Fund. Now, that's come out of the disestablishment of the Ward Discretionary Fund. So the Individual and Teams Fund, when we were looking at the Ward Discretionary Fund, we noted that a significant portion of it was going to support individuals and teams who were representing the district. So they're people that have succeeded and have been have an opportunity to compete or to access development around leaderships and things for the district, and so it's a way of the district supporting it. What we saw was around the $50,000 to $53,000 amount mark of the $86,000 Ward Discretionary Fund was allocated to individuals and teams. And so what this did was it carved that off, and then it put the rest of the remainder of that fund, the $33,000 remaining, into the community fund, which has got a large draw taking place on that. And then what is agreed is that alongside the contestable funds, all of those which will be heard by the assessment panel, and what a contestable fund is that there's an open application process that people from the community apply to, and the assessment panel looks at that and weighs up all the pros and the cons and the amount of funding they have to give out to community, and they make a determination about what that investment will be in those particular activities. So the council actually has quite a lot of opportunity to drive the direction it wants this community funding. Most of the community funding is actually contestable. There are a number of non-contestable funds. That means that the assessment panel doesn't hear them, and it's typically where it's a really specific thing and a specific set of criteria that are being used that just requires a decision rather than a consideration against other things. So, for example, the Mayor and Councillors Discretionary Fund, you each have an allocation which allows you to respond to requests from community without that going through the assessment panel process. There is the Youth Council Projects Fund. It's a small fund of $10,000. What that does is it It used to exist. It's always been there, but was contestable. But what we noted was that young people don't apply for contestable funds, and the kind of organisations working in those spaces weren't as well. And yet you've got a youth council that's very competent, that knows the pulse of the community, is able to go out and seek input from the community and guidance from councillors and a whole range of other people. And so it's a small fund that enables them to implement and support projects for youth in their community. There's the Meet Your Street Fund. So this is a fund that encourages residents to connect in their streets. And it's all about building social connection. And through that, it's about building things like safety and resiliency. So we know that, for example, if there's a major emergency, a flooding event, then it'll be neighbours supporting neighbours. If there's an earthquake and things are down, it'll be neighbours supporting neighbours. So part of that's actually about building opportunity for neighbours to come together and build those relationships and that trust. So it increases safety, it increases social connection, but it also increases resiliency. So that fund is a $10,000 a year fund, and basically if a street wants to get together, it provides up to $100, so it's paid on receipts, it's not just a grant out, for certain things that will enable that group to come together and inspire that group to come together. So it's a support. It's about encouraging that community connection. And because it's very small amounts, it's based on receipts, there's really clear criteria around it. It doesn't need to be a contestable fund. It allows it to be a very fast turnaround and response. And so that is done through the Community Services and Facilities team. There's the Community Pools Fund. So we have 15 community pools in our district that sit with schools, and if those pools are made available to the district or to residents outside of school hours, then the council contributes $1,000 a year. That's just inclusive, so whatever that is without the GST. A very small contribution to their operating costs, just to acknowledge the fact that this pool is there for the benefit of the wider community. And that fund is $14,000 per year. And the decisions around that are also made by the Community Services and Facilities team. There's a Heritage Consents Fund, and so the purpose of this is some of the heritage protection work requires a resource consent to be done, and so the purpose of this $20,000 fund is to assist owners in mana whenua with fees associated with building or resource consents to complete heritage protection projects. And so this, once again, has very clear criteria around it, and it is managed by the Development and Growth team who are looking after the consents process. There's a waste minimisation fund that's $10,000 a year, and the purpose of that's to try and support community events to reduce the amount of waste going to landfill. It's a very small fund, and what happens is when a community event seeks the consents needed to run that event, they're offered the opportunity to offset some of their waste costs at once again, it's based on receipts at landfill in an effort to try and drive down. So our teams work with them on reducing their waste overall and trying to reduce the amount of waste going to landfill. So that's a $10,000 a year fund, and that is made by the Property and Infrastructure team who work in the waste management area. There's the Residents Group Grant, and you'll see quite a discussion on this in the briefing paper that you've got today. And the purpose of this was to support the residents groups with a contribution to operational costs, but also to some initiatives that they may well be doing in their community. The fund is $24,000 a year, and that is based on the number of recognised residents groups when the committees were wound up, those that considered themselves to be or moved into a new form to be a residents group. Based on the feedback that was given at the workshop on the 7th of August, where there was concerns about a burgeoning of residents groups or groups wanting to have access to $1,000, which was the initial proposal, we realised that we needed to make the criteria about what a recognised residents group is about, and so that's in your briefing paper, but also the fund is $24,000. So if there are 24 residence groups and they all apply for the fund, then it's $1,000. That is the maximum amount that can be granted. So if only 10 apply, then only 10,000 is allocated. If 30 apply, then it comes down to 800 that's allocated per group. So the amount per group varies according on the number of groups that have applied up to a maximum amount. So it can't go beyond that $1,000 a group. I did have something I was going to say there, it's completely slipped my mind. And the decision maker around that, because there are clear criteria, it is the Community Services and Facilities team that would make that decision as well. I think important just to be aware that the non-contestable funds, so those that are given out by staff around these specific criteria, they will be part of the reporting. So there will be quarterly reporting to the assessment panel across the whole funding program that shows what kind of activities are being funded, what the spread is across the ward, what the particular outcome is that's being achieved, so that the assessment panel are able to shift their future decisions based on that and make much more strategic and much more transparent decisions. So that will come into being as part of this process. And then in addition to the contestable and the non-contestable funds are two funds that we administer on behalf of others. And so the government through two agencies grants money to council to administer on their behalf. And that's the Sport New Zealand Rural Travel Fund. So that's $27,000 a year. It has its own panel because it comes with a set of criteria that is driven by the funder who provides that money. And it's to support teams to compete outside the district. So it's for rural junior sports teams competing in local sporting competitions outside of school hours. So it's not supporting in-school sports. And then the creative community schemes, which in your paper it's 52,320. We've just received notification last week that that's been increased to 61,000. So there's a wee bit extra to go around there. And that is delivered on behalf of the creative community schemes. There is a panel for that, an assessment panel. Once again, it's a requirement of that fund. And the purpose of this particular fund is to increase participation in the arts at a community level and to increase the range and the diversity of arts available to the community. So you'll see that there are some funds focused on environment and maintaining, protecting and enhancing our environment through tree planting and predator control. So, and I think the really critical thing about that is the enormous amount of volunteer effort that's being put in and the benefit that those environmental funds are bringing into the district that's really significant. Then you've got the heritage protection, another significant fund, and once again it enables council to achieve its responsibilities in regards to heritage protection and maintenance of the things that are listed on your district plan. And then the community fund, which is enabling all those community-led initiatives that are being run by volunteers in our community and actually make it a place that people want to live. It's a place where you come and you go, actually there's a space here, I can take my child along to that, or I can be involved in that, or there's this activity or event going on. It enables us to support our small local museums and local history groups. It enables us to do those things or support community to do those things. It's an acknowledgement. It is not supporting all of their costs by a country mile. And then there's the range of the other I think also worth mentioning is the Strategic Events Fund, which is going to bring benefit and supports what's happening in the economic development strategy that was endorsed recently by council. So that's sort of a sum up of what the community program looks like at this particular point.
Thank you for that run through, and it's really good to hear the diversity of the funds and also the decision making around that. So councillors, today's not discussing the amount of funding in total that was decided through the long-term plan. If we want to discuss the total amount of funding, then that's next year's annual plan, and if we need to have a workshop as part of that annual plan specific to community funding, if that's what councillors want, then we can do that. Today is looking at the makeup of the funds and the decision making around where that goes. So keen to have any further discussion that's going to help us set this in place, recognising already that this fund has technically been available to the community since the 1st of July. We need to make some decisions so that it can be delivered to the community who are expecting that we would have these funds available. Deborah.
Thank you. I'm not going to talk about the fact that this cost is over $1 million. I'm going to talk about the process of about how we got here with some of these projects, from my perspective, through the LTP process. With regards to the LTP process, I don't recall, and I could not find where we had an itemised breakdown presented to us, line by line, for us to discuss in the LTP process the allocation of the money to these particular funds, where there is going to be new funds, and consequently where some of the funds that I'm looking at, I would term, you'd have to question, are we double dipping? And one of those that I'll bring through are where we've got non-contestable funds that have a budget element given to them that I would have actually assumed would have been in the day-to-day operating budgets of the respective managers or the the executive directors. Waste minimisation, the waste is one, and then we're going to give out grants for waste minimisation that are non-contestable. Surely that should have been included in the whole breakdown of the budget that was presented for the LTP process.
Well, let's answer that to begin with, because I think that has come up a few times. These accusations of double dipping. Can you talk to? Do we give? I haven't
finished yet, Sam. That's just one question.
That's fine, but that one question I think deserves attention. We don't give money twice for the same thing.
No,
okay.
Not intentionally.
Do you know of any examples where we have?
No, I am aware that in the past, and it's one of the reasons why changes to the community funding program were supported. In the past, because of the funding mechanisms, community groups could apply for grants from multiple places for similar or same purposes. And I'm aware that on occasion community groups have received grants from multiple grants because it wasn't able to be seen.
That's part of us trying to clean this up now.
That's right.
We don't have any more double dipping if it happened.
Yeah.
Okay, cool, thanks. Deborah, any other questions?
Yes. With regards to just looking at the funding for the councillor and mayoral discretionary fund, I understand that fund is allocated at $2,500 per councillor, which comes to 25,000 Yet we've got a budget in here for 30,000. So can I ask what the other 5,000 is for, please? So it's 5,000 for the mayor and 2,500 for the councillors. Okay, thank you for that clarification. And then the mayor has a mayoral fund as well. Separate? No?
There's a mayoral relief fund that we often have open that if an event occurs and the government might give money or the Red Cross might give money or there might be coming donations from the community, then there's a fund that's available for people to deposit their donations into for that. Thank you.
My next question is around the Soil and Natural Environment Fund. Yes, we did agree that we would fund predator-free at 50k per annum in our LTP process. I note that the budget for the Soil and Natural Environmental Fund is set at 225,000. Was that the fund that was what was allocated to it last year, or allocated to it in the LTP process this year? So it's allocated to it in the LTP process this year. Okay, this is where I'm lacking the understanding of the information, because unless someone can show me the documentation of where we had a line-by-line breakdown itemisation of these particular funds with the particular funding, I don't know how much has been increased. It's okay saying we're adopting the LTP, here's your community funds, this is what we're granting, say $1 million. But then suddenly we start having the breakdown in a workshop afterwards. We're putting, as far as I'm
concerned... Point of order, Mr Mayor.
Sorry.
Aren't some of these SNF funds from external funders and not our own balance sheet?
No.
I'll just let Deborah finish them out, but yeah.
Sorry.
And we'll clarify where the funding comes from, but Deborah...
Thank you, because this is what I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to clarify the amount of funding and where it's coming from. And through this process, can we actually make combined or bundle some of these funding opportunities together, like the Selwyn Natural Environmental Fund and the Predator Free Fund? That would come to $275,000. So why are we looking at them separately when we've got a report from our biodiversity program update where they're actually bundled together in the reports that we've got? So I'm just trying to understand why we're trying to separate ones out. Another one I will use is where it's suggested that dinners for Selwyn, and we've got Meet the Street. While it's a small amount, I have attended dinners for Selwyn, and while it's a great initiative, the amount of support that needs to be given to it when you're looking at $300, is that $300 per person to attend, or is that $300 per function? Because it wasn't clear in the report. And, you know, I mean, we really have to start cutting our cloth somewhere. If we've got projects that are great initiatives, but they're not supported by the community, why are we continuing to run them?
Well, Deborah, there's a few questions there, so we'll get to some of them. I think the report is pretty clear that it says the amount per Meet Your Street event is increased to $100. So that's not per person that comes along into it. Suggested it is 3.7.2 in the report. It's it pretty clearly. I don't think, Council, if we're going to discuss what's going to be spent on $300, I just don't really think that's our role here when we're discussing $40 million expenditure and rates rises for our community at 15%. I think it's good that we consider all expenditure, but staff presented to us the budgets before the long-term plan was adopted. We've had the conversations about where the long-term plan sits. And if we want to challenge that again, I think it is an annual plan conversation. And as a part of that, if you receive a budget line that says there's $1 million and it's made up of 10 things, then that's where we do have these discussions now, because we recognise that within that $1 million there's a whole lot of extra spending. And so staff have done, I think, a good job at presenting this report to be clear with us about where that money goes. There are a couple of other questions there, Deborah. I'll get Nicola to answer some of those other things.
So I'm just responding to the question about the bringing together of the Predator Free and the Natural Environment Fund. The two funds there were on the advice of the Council's Environment Biodiversity team, and they do have different purposes and outcomes that they're driving for. So there is an overarching purpose and outcome, of course, is to protect the environment and increase the biodiversity in the district, but they have quite different focuses. And one was about lifting the amount of work done around predator control in the community. So that's my understanding of it.
And through the deliberations, Predator Free was expressly supported by the councillors to be a new thing for the community. So hence why they're left separate and not put together, because as councillors, we supported a Predator Free initiative for Selwyn. Deborah, was there anything else that wasn't answered in your questions?
No, I think I've made my point clear with regards to how I would perceive a clearer process for me in the decision-making role should have been to our LGP process.
Thank you. Bob?
Yeah, probably start with heritage, that Phil was talking about. I think that, yes, we have got a bigger community and a lot more communities, but I still believe that even if Rolleston had 14 committees, they still haven't got the same amount of heritage. So I think the amount of committees is a real red herring. I think that, and we sat on the fund and we pruned it down. We didn't give all the funding, which I think is really important. For a lot of these funds, we don't, because the fund's there, we don't have to give it. And we didn't in that case, but I think it was 27,000 we left in the pot, which will go back. But I think that's part of good stewardship by us as councillors. And I think if you're going to start splitting things into Rolleston should get this or Melbourne should get this, I think it's totally wrong. The other thing that I am opposed to, and there are groups that have been getting funds every year and they have got quite significant amounts of funds in their own accounts. And at the end of some of these events, they actually give money back to the community. So I really think that we should be looking at that side of it. There's significant money into some groups, and it's year after year after year, and the money, it's just a way of getting money out of the council to give to their communities. So I think that's something that I really want to see looked at.
Bob, how would you see that addressed through this? Is there some wording that you're suggesting, or is there an approach, or is there further discussion you'd like to have ahead of the next annual plan on that?
I just think that it comes down to the committee or the group that are funding this, that they should be looking at this sort of thing, and it should be somewhere in the criteria that you can't apply more than once every 5 years. I don't know the wording, but I just think there's significant money that is going around, and it's been, as I say, it's wrong to me. But as far as the smaller funds go, I know the communities look forward to it, and seeing that we're charging people to use the halls and things now, I think the small funding for those community committees is well worthwhile. Probably not enough in my opinion, but that's and the other thing is, I think with the bigger fund, the large fund, our community fund, I think the criteria should be a bit tighter than it is. I haven't sat on it, but I think some of the things that have been asked for are a bit frivolous, to be quite honest. So I think it's all a matter of the panel actually sitting down and coming up with something that is fair, and maybe it would reduce these funds in year to come. But that's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. Nicola, any thoughts on what Bob said?
Not an awful lot to add, but I do think that there is an opportunity through the assessment panel to set strategic priorities for funds, and as long as those are advertised when funds are opened up, I think that becomes really clear to communities. So there may well be things where the assessment panel goes, actually we're getting 100 applications, we can only afford to fund 50 things, what are our priorities going to be this coming year, and those could be set, and it could be associated with the likes of your strategies. So you are going to be asked to endorse a youth strategy and an ageing strategy. It may be that the community funding prioritises things associated with those strategies over the next wee while, and so it allows council to be much more strategic about where it wants those community funds to go and what it wants to support in community.
Well, thank you. Megan.
Oh, yes, kia ora. So first of all, I just want to say that I agree with the approach of consolidating the funding and bringing transparency to the funding process and decisions. And when it comes to a decision by council next week, if I had a vote, I'd be voting to disestablish the current regime and replace it with what's proposed in this paper. And I acknowledge that this is just phase one of doing it differently and doing it better, and there will be time to stop and review this, over the next coming year or so. But because I agree with the overall direction, I've got some quite specific comments to help guide the decision making for next week. So the first is around the independent board member, which is on page 4 of your paper and the terms of reference. And with that, I was one of the people that did not support an independent board member. So I think it would be really helpful to come as a decision, as a separate decision next week in the paper to say, take a vote on that part. I personally can't see the value in what they would bring, but if it was separated out, that would be helpful to decide. The second is a general comment around the secondary student fund, which is on page 5, and just wanted to acknowledge that I've also read Nicole's feedback that she emailed to us, and I agree with her. I don't have school-age children. My children are all older. I do agree with some of the comments she's made. Specifically for me, I support the 4 scholarships for rangatahi that have to go to school outside of this takiwā. And I support that because I've had a special needs child that did not have schooling available in the takiwā. Next is, next week when you're writing your paper on the Strategic Partnerships Fund, often it's referred to when it's talking about the money that's been allocated to mana whenua, it just refers to taumutu, but my understanding is that fund is for taumutu and ngai tohuriri. And I think that's just been missed by accident more than anything else. But also note that on that one, there's still a discussion to be had with taumutu on the purpose of the fund and the process to access it. And I know that's going to be had next week, I think. And I'm unsure about ngai tohuriri. I agree with the Strategic Partnership Fund not starting fresh each year because there's still those discussions to be had. When it comes to the policy itself, and maybe this is not necessary for next week, but something to consider as part of a wider review, or the next review of what we're trying to achieve with this process, is the Mayor and Councillor Discretion Fund. My understanding of that is that they're confidential, like they're paid out and in a confidential way, or are they transparent and reported on who gets what?
They're not confidential in that there's no agreement to be confidential, but there isn't a mechanism for that to be considered part of the reporting. And if there was a requirement for something to be confidential, if there was something, really, I can't think of a situation, then there'd be capacity within it to keep something confidential. But basically, it's more of the same. So what I've seen in terms of allocations from the Mayor and Councillors discretionary funds is it's community groups, or it may be an individual going to do something in the community. So it's no different really to what's happening in the other funds.
Right, and it will be reported on.
Yes, so that will be reported to the assessment panel. So it's part of the reporting they get, and that just keeps that transparency and enables the assessment panel to just go, actually, this group's been funded through this mechanism, so therefore we won't fund them through that mechanism there. So it just enables that.
That's really helpful because that's not what I had understood. So great, thanks. On my final comment is on the Ellesmere Reserves Board, and on page 36 you've really helped, and 35 you've helpfully taken us through the history and the purpose and what the funding's been used for, and you also say that the internal legal team is actually having a look at that right now to determine what it can be used for. And then the next page goes on to say that councillors indicated a preference that the funds go to Waihora Whatarau, or the Leaston development. My understanding is that that was an idea rather than a preference that we'd all agreed upon. And as much as I think it's a really good idea, I think it makes more sense to get the legal advice before that decision is made.
So one of the challenges is that some of the legal advice is around the status of the land and what has happened over the history, and looking into the deed and the wills and etc. And so there's quite a time required for that. It's not a fast process, and so that is being unpicked and managed within the legal team capacity. The challenge is that the council have had responsibility for the fund for a number of years now and has not allocated that, and there is growing pressure from groups that have previously accessed it who would like to see council take that up. So what's been put into this paper is perhaps council may want to take a balanced approach where some of the money is for the redevelopment of Leaston Park, and some of the money is open for a contestable funding round. The recommendation, unfortunately, because of the timing of council papers, the paper's actually in already. So I can think about what I'm hearing today and come armed or come prepared with some alternative recommendations that council might want to have. But the question really is what the recommendation puts forward: a balanced approach both, an open contestable element plus some money being used for the Leeston Park renewal program. But council actually has the opportunity to then take that recommendation and determine it goes one way or the other. So really it was just putting something down to give council an opportunity to work through with it. I'm just wondering, Megan, whether I just very quickly address a couple of your other points.
Just before you do, I just think we'll just clarify around the changes that might be able to be made to the paper for next week after this conversation.
Yeah, and that's the purpose of the briefing and discussion today. So the agenda has not been posted, so there is an opportunity to amend and make changes to the paper because we're intending to publish tomorrow morning.
Okay, right. So if we're wanting amendments in the paper around recommendations, I probably need to get some clear guidance on that.
Well, I think we've taken some guidance because the workshop is not a decision-making process, but we've got some guidance here and we can make some amendments to the paper. So Denise, you and I can have a conversation afterwards.
Thank you. Sorry, finish what you were going to say.
Yeah. Just in relation to the strategic partnerships funding, there's two parts to it. One part, previously the Taumotu partnership funding was contained in the broader strategic partnership fund, and it was on the same basis where it could come and go, and it was a decision that was made every 3 years. Council approved in the November paper, agreed in the November paper that it would take the strategic partnerships with mana whenua out of that process. And so the strategic partnership funding for Taumotu and Ngāi Tuahuriri is outside of that. It's a different strategic partnership. So that's why it's got a very brief mention in the paper, because it's just addressing what came through in the approval. But actually the strategic partnership funding that's being talked about here is for community groups. It's not for relationship with mana whenua. So you won't see that come back through in the paper going forward. And then just a comment on the independent board member. So once again, we can certainly reflect that. We tried to shape the policy after the workshop on the August the 7th. We tried to shape the policy so it's very clear that there's only independent board members on the assessment panel if the assessment panel decide they want them. And it may be that they only want them for a particular purpose or a particular moment in time, or they don't want them at all. So there's no compulsion. But what it does is it does allow the assessment panel the ability to bring in some additional support around or additional expertise for a period of time. And so the policy is really just giving the assessment panel the opportunity to do it. I suspect it won't be taken up, certainly not initially, but may be something that council would want to do at some point. But
that's really helpful. Thank you. Just one question from what you've explained. When it comes to that Taumotu and Ngāi Tuahuriri strategic funding, does that still then, is the board still responsible for it?
No. So it's completely outside. So it's not subject to that. It is it sits within the democracy part of council in terms of it's not something that is up for a decision.
Right.
Through a contestable process or any other process like that, it is.
That makes sense about the decision making, but I would imagine councillors would still want a level of transparency or reporting somehow through.
I would imagine that. Great. Yeah, I can't comment on that. I don't know how that's been treated.
Yeah, thank you.
And so just thinking about some of the things Megan raised here around the recommendations, the removal of the existing work and the adoption of the new stuff, I think needs to be really clear within the policy, and whether the people that are currently sitting on the panel want to be the same people for consistency through the term. I think we should be clear about that is happening or not happening depending on how councillors feel. But if those that are, I'm not hearing today that we want to change the people that are involved, but if the people that are there still currently want to stay there, I think we should just say that in the paper next week, and then we know who the panel is making these decisions. Malcolm, are you happy to stay on as chair?
No, I was actually going to say I've done it for 6 years, and maybe it's time for somebody else to take on the chairmanship role. So I'm happy to step back and let other councillors be involved.
I'll just have this quick discussion before we get to you, Sophie, if that's all right, on the involvement, Phil.
Isn't that the whole principle? Is that it is going to be be constitutive of one group is going to make all the decisions?
Yes, but who is that group and who are the councillors on that group?
But so therefore we can't have the existing people being the same as the new group too.
So if councillors could please have a think ahead of next week, whether they want to be involved or not, and we'll have some draft names ahead, but if the report can please have some blanks so that we know we're making some decisions on who those councillors are, will be helpful.
How do you want us to indicate this to them?
Just tell us and we'll take names with me. Sophie.
Yeah, kia ora ladies and people, thank you very much as well. Thank you for your work on all of this. I support continuing having funds. I think they're genuinely a good use of ratepayer money that comes in, because it does enable, as we've said several times this morning, it's an enabling fund, several enabling funds. People can come together with mutual interest. It enhances cohesion. That then in turn turns into community safety and resilience. And frankly, I don't see many of these groups having particularly other options in terms of sourcing funds for various things. Most of them are volunteers. Their activities, they already, most of them charge membership funds. When we meet for the community support fund, like, we look and see what people are being charged. Like, this isn't a free ride. We're not covering all the costs that they have. This is, quite often, it's just helping out with a bit of venue hire. Although sometimes it's a rather large amount of venue hire, if it's something like a big inter-club competition at Foster Park, but then they're putting in hundreds of hours of volunteer work, much like with the Environment Fund, with the, with the plantings and everything else like that. It's more than money, and sometimes getting that money across the line is the difference between something happening and just not happening at all. And it is of benefit to our community across the whole place. I think my favourite part is the increased transparency that this is going to bring. We're going to be tracking stuff better. If we have accusations of double dipping, then, actually it'd be a lot easier to go, actually, no, that's not the case. If we see groups coming back with slightly different initiatives, trying again and again to get the whole thing funded, well, we can look at that in a bit more detail, and that's a good thing. In terms of proportionality, I actually have no problem with Wollaston getting less for heritage funding, because the historical part of our town is quite small. Much like with SNEF funding, not really seeing a great deal of opportunity for SNEF funding, but not much in Wollaston. But then proportionally, it would be good to see going forward, how much of the other funds, given the population size, the ones that are population based, even down to things like the tertiary scholarships. We've got way more youth in the other wards. So that's something that would be really interesting to track properly with actual data. And, even just seeing what the larger funds that sometimes at the moment, larger applications get tagged as being in Wollaston, except that they're actually sometimes regional events. If we could, we'll be good. And I guess the other part is ward boundaries change. So we can't actually just stick at it and say, oh, Wollaston's not getting enough. The boundaries keep changing. We do that too. I would suggest, though, that maybe some of our funds could do with a maximum, because we do sometimes get some who you think, okay, you're really having a laugh now. Given the size of the fund, particularly some of these funds, some groups seem to think that they can go for the entire annual fund in one go, but they're always oversubscribed. It's not like in some ways, some people will tell us that we're tight, but there you go. And there's one section, I think it's 5.1.4, says that some applications might be required to give a bit more detail about what the costs and benefits are to the Selwyn area. I think that's a great thing, but I don't think we can do that with our current template. The template that we've got at the moment is really good for small groups like Taitapu Garden Club, where they've just got a very simple in and out. But if we're asking for more detail, it would be really good. I think it would save staff time as well, going backwards and forwards and trying to find out more information, rather than just giving them a big open box to describe what they need. A couple of things that I'm not sure that we've addressed adequately, and I don't think they've been raised yet. At 5.2, it's an interesting one. Just a query for consideration. Why are staff and councillors excluded? Just because there's a whole lot of mention around that. I have no intention of applying for any of these funds anytime soon. But, you know, we do have staff particularly, and potentially councillors at some point, who might have a need for applying for an individual thing if they happen to represent in some shape or form. There's plenty elsewhere in there about managing your conflicts. It would just be good to find out a bit more there. And another one is at 7.8. What if there is no alternate ward councillor, which isn't an issue that Wollaston and Springs are likely to have anytime soon, but potentially that might be an issue for Malvern and Ellesmere going forward. So what is the backup plan? I think in the previous workshop we were like, do we maybe get somebody from one of the local residents groups that is agreed on behalf of the rest of them that they can represent? Or is that not adequate? Like, what do you, or is plan B that you defer the meeting to another date? So it would be good to have some thinking around that. Thanks.
So Sophie, would it help if the wording was changed to or delegate another councillor? And then that leaves it.
If those guys are okay with that, because it's not really something that I think I should really.
No, but I understand where you're coming from. Yeah.
It's future proofing. We don't know what the outcome is going to be of that other process, so let's just keep it future proofed. Nicola?
I had given it some thought, given the representation review that's underway, and thought that if the boundaries were to change, we would need to address that in the policy in that particular situation. So tried not to leap ahead, really, was building based on that, and thought it was a relatively minor change that could be dealt with as part of a whole raft of changes I suspect will be needed if boundaries change. Just in relation to the why not councillors and council staff, etc. When we were putting together the policy, we did look at a significant number of other council policies in relation to funding, and it was it was pretty much in every single one. And it's not so much, as you say, you have systems in place for conflict of interest, but actually perception of conflict of interest. I think for a community, the number of times and the likelihood is actually really quite small. And if it's about council or council staff involvement in a group, then others in that group will just need to take on that responsibility. I hadn't considered a councillor or council staff member wanting to go for an individual fund, and I probably would suggest that this isn't the place that happens, would be my call on that particular one. Just in relation to, you just mentioned about having a cap on the amount of funding that could be given out. So sitting alongside the policy's at governance level, and the aim of keeping it at governance level is so we don't have to keep coming back with minor shifts based on what the assessment panel is seeing and experiencing. So the assessment panel have got some delegated authority around certain fund-specific criteria that it can set that doesn't need to come back, as long as the policy around the purpose and the outcomes of the funds stays at council level, then the assessment panel has some delegated authority to make some of those sorts of things specifically in place. And so the assessment panel certainly could say, actually, the maximum grant for this particular fund is going to be, and as long as we publish that on the website and the community is aware of it, then that's a perfectly acceptable process. So the fund schedules, any amendments to the fund schedules at that level have to be approved by, or proposed and approved by, the assessment panel, which just stops staff from making shifts to fund schedules without that approval and process. So there's quite a robust process to try and keep things at the right level, at the governance level, and then at the operational level, but with councillor involvement in that.
Yeah, thank you for that. For me, that's kind of around managing expectations, because sometimes you see them come in and they're literally expecting to get 16 grand. Yeah. No.
Yes, yeah. And we could do a better job of, a typical grant is normally X to X. It just sets that expectation too. Yeah.
Cool. Nicole was hoping to join us. She had written through some questions. I think we've touched on the things that she had raised in the conversation so far, so thank you, councillors, for that. Nicola and Claire, thank you for the conversation today. Obviously, the paper will come back to council next week with some updates and recommendation clarity around what we're deciding. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Councillors, we'll break for 13 minutes. We'll start again at 10:30. So if I could ask you to just grab your hot drink and come back to the table by 10:30, please. T201. Take it away.
Tamaria, good morning. Yep, we're the tree team today, so I'll just do a really brief introduction, and I've got Ryan King, strategy planner from the strategy team, and we've got Mason, arboricultural advisor, so crack team today. I just want to set the context really for the review of this tree policy. So when we first had our committees have their inaugural meetings, we had a matter around the removal of trees for some roading projects around Fairhurst Place, Markham Way, and that kind of brought to the fore a question around, well, where would that sit? Is it the Transport and Infrastructure Committee? Is it the Planning and Climate Change Committee? Those are some of the crossovers identified by the chairs of the two respective committees, and then there was from the Planning and Climate Change chair a direction to look into the tree policy, specifically the policy, and also about the loss of trees or loss of urban tree canopy cover. So when we took that away and started thinking about this in the strategy team, we saw two distinct pieces of work there. One being the tree policy itself, which is what we're going to primarily talk about today, and also this separate matter about tree canopy cover, which is about projecting the area of a tree crown as a two-dimensional rather than three-dimensional aspect, and then quantifying that, which is typically done with remote sensing data, so that's aerial imagery and LiDAR, and that's happening in the background with a very talented geospatial team, so that's happening as a separate matter. But the tree policy is what looks after our council trees on public land, and we wanted to look at the tree policy, check it was fit for purpose and is up to date with best practice, and check that it's the right policy to manage our trees going forward. So we undertook some work about that, which Ryan and Mason will be able to present on today, the kind of process and some of our initial thinking, and just really keen to hear from all of you, what you're hearing from our communities around council trees. I know we've heard quite a bit through public forums of some specific instances, but it'd be really good to show our initial thinking and also hear from all of you. So without further ado, I'll just pass on to Ryan to run you through his presentation.
So cast your mind back to early last year. You might recall how it originally started in the Transport and Infrastructure Committee. And then I suppose it was identified the crossovers between the two committees. So then moving forward, the Planning and Climate Change Committee then did a bit of work looking into that in a bit more detail. So yeah, we provided a bit more information about the loss of trees, tree canopy cover, tree management, as well as council policies. And within that, there was an action for staff to review the tree planting policy and a bit more further information and discussion on the work implications and policy review also happened. So then looking at what we've done internally, since those committee meetings, we formed a project group internally with staff from across council and to advance the review of the policy in relation to trees. So essentially we started looking at best practice, gap analysis and examples of where we could improve. So throughout 2024, we did a few further internal workshops, started drafting a bit of a policy and started looking into that in a bit more detail. So why are we having this briefing today? Going back to early 2023, the Transport and Infrastructure Committee identified transport projects such as that Markham Way and Fairhurst Place were instances where council's policy on tree removal and replanting was unclear. So the outcome of our internal project group review was that we're getting good improvements to connectivity, but as was raised by the committee, there was perhaps a missed opportunity for a better outcome for those trees. So additional to Markham Way and Fairhurst Place, we also looked at council and how we currently manage our trees and the challenges that we're currently facing. So back in early 2023, the committee identified infrastructure works as a challenge, but we also found working around trees to be a big area for improvement. We also found other challenges such as leaf litter, shading, underground infrastructure problems, as well as overhead infrastructure such as power lines to be a bit of a challenge that we're currently facing. So as part of our review, we identified the policy manual, which was last reviewed in December 2021, as the starting basis for assessing the sufficiency of Council's policies in relation to trees. So the policy manual contains T201, Vegetation and Tree Management Policy. Also at the same time, we identified the Trees and Vegetation in Selwyn District Management Policy, which was adopted in 2010. So this policy has a bit of a different purpose to T201, given that it's a bit more of a technical and a comprehensive document. So staff use the one on the right as a bit more of a compliance and guidance document, such as for minimum offsets for vehicle crossings to trees, but also vegetation height rules for sight lines at intersections. So as a project group, we concluded it might be better just to have a bit more of an updated policy that's reflective of changes to best practice since 2010. And overall, a lot's changed since the last review. Industry has changed, best practice has shifted, so it's probably a good time for us to start thinking about the next steps and what we might want to do as an organisation going forward. So in the industry, the Christchurch City Council tree policy is considered best practice. So other councils that are also reviewing their tree policies are using the Christchurch tree policy as the starting point. Queenstown Lakes District Council is a good example. They followed the Christchurch policy and then tailored to their own needs. So our project team identified there's an opportunity for Selwyn to use this as a basis, and then we can adapt and add based on our needs. More importantly, when we discussed with industry, we also found that the same contractors within our district generally work across Greater Christchurch. And by also following the Christchurch tree policy, we can expect a bit more better compliance. And our contractors who are already familiar with the Christchurch tree policy, they're used to their operating environment, and perhaps that's an opportunity for us to start to follow on from that. Also, council staff have attended many different events and forums, such as the Urban Forest Symposium at the University of Canterbury last year, and are looking to incorporate contemporary and emerging best practice, both domestically and internationally, into the proposed tree policy. So of note, you may recall last year, a keynote speech from the conference by Simon Upton, which was presented to councillors on his visit to council. So most instances where our proposed tree policy could diverge from the tree policies of Christchurch City Council and Queenstown Lakes District Council, it's from our own learnings and our operating environment, but also discussions with other councils like Christchurch on what does and does not work in reality from their policies. So altogether, this has informed a direction for what we could do in our proposed policy. So similar to Christchurch, we could have 4 sections. So our existing T201 Vegetation and Tree Management Policy, this has 3 of these 4 sections. And what's proposed is a new working around trees section, reflecting the experience that we've seen and also what's now considered best practice. So going into a bit more detail on the sections, so section 1 for tree planting, the biggest change is a shift in approach to planting in the right place with the right tree for the right function, but also tying this back to a focus on urban canopy cover. So similar to other recent tree policies nationally, if trees are removed in a project, a minimum of 2 new trees will be planted for every tree removed. And council in some of our recent projects is already moving this direction. So looking at our projects and where we can actively seek new planting opportunities. So a good example of this is with Te Arotia, where we have a really well thought out planting, where it's in the right place, for the right tree, for the right function. So the established trees were retained along Tennyson Street, with some exotic hero trees in the right place, supported by appropriate natives where they're better suited. So the biggest change to maintenance of trees in public places is to reinforce long-term tree health. So maintaining trees accordingly with updates to avoid now unsound practices, or where we now know of better methods since the last review of the policy. One of the big things there is to develop a tree risk management procedure, similar to what Christchurch City Council has, to ensure that familiarity with our contractors. But also to set out how we would like our trees maintained, providing a bit more clarity and expectations. But also in order to ensure trees are healthy in the long term, we need an up-to-date database on tree assets. So this was an action in the 2010 policy, but with advances in technology, this now has a lower financial implication, and having that database would bring in efficiencies and allow us to better prioritise our resources. So section 3 is an entirely new section which we don't currently have, and this could set out how we would like to work around our trees. So similar to Christchurch, and our contractors are familiar with that, it's about having better oversight in what we do. So look, it won't be required for every single tree, but ensuring that those that do need it have better protection. So this may require approvals from Council's Arboriculture Advisor and a tree protection management plan. So you'll see the diagram on the right there, and it's about ensuring that our contractors consider the impacts of works and keeping in mind things like the tree protection zone. The trees identified as important. Best practice would be to utilise asset protection bonds, which gives that greater incentive on protecting the trees during works. So we've got an above example there of a recent pumping station that Cord worked on. And Cord, they're familiar with the Christchurch tree policy and how that works, and they did a good job there. The trees, although in close proximity to their works, they were retained, protected throughout, and were kept healthy, and they can continue to grow and coexist with the infrastructure with that long-term view in mind. We've also found a few examples where we're losing trees that are intended to be vested to council in future open space. So it's about putting in place some practices so we can capture those trees which are currently private, but through the subdivision process may end up as public trees in the future, and some of our open spaces that are vested to us. So we want to make sure that those big mature trees can stay protected and healthy throughout that process, so that when we do get the trees in public ownership in our reserves, they're not left unhealthy or unsafe, or that we would need to replace going forward. So the biggest shift in section 4 would be to prioritise existing mature trees with removal as a last resort. And through those better oversight processes, we would know which trees we wanted to protect, and if it's valuable, look to retain it. So you'll see the example there of the oak tree of Parliament, showing there are options, although that's the extreme end of the scale. But to do this, we will consider the value of an existing mature tree, either through the cost of replacement or repair and loss and inboard damage. Keeping in mind existing mature trees, council's put a lot of money and resources into them over time. You've got to consider the purchase price of the tree, the cost of planting, water, and maintaining that tree for its life. So if we remove a tree, we then have to repeat those costs. So by determining the value, it keeps us better informed if it's cheaper to alter the design of works of infrastructure or if replacement is a better option. So we haven't decided on a valuation method yet, but we'll be going through looking at identifying a recognised system for valuing council trees and finding a method that's going to work best for us and implement that. Just to note, wilding, noxious or pest trees, they'll be removed where they're a threat or as a pest species or cause a nuisance, so there's still that process to allow that. So going forward, we've got our briefing today. We'll incorporate some feedback back to our council project team. And then later on this year, we'll come back with an updated tree policy for consideration and adoption. And then post-adoption, we'll go through our internal processes, review them, develop some new procedures, do updates where required, and a bit of comms and guidance around that. So what we'd like to understand is, I suppose, what you're hearing and seeing out in the community. What's your experiences that you've heard about trees, and anything that we could consider, or anything you'd like us to have a look into further?
Great, thank you. That brings the end of the presentation. Cool. Councillors, it'd be good to hear your views on this. It's been obviously coming up over the last 24 months quite regularly, and a lot of conversations in our community about trees as well, and with council's done works, and as was highlighted by the staff, different views around how things need to be done. I think we need to start from, trees out-survive people, and so the trees that we plant today should be here for generations to come. And in a new town like Rolleston, I think it's a real shame that we don't have much of a tree canopy cover. It'd be interesting, George, for you to show us through some of the work that has been done on that tree canopy stuff. And even in our older existing towns, as they've grown, the tendency has been to provide grass everywhere and not a whole lot of trees. And I think not enough has been, we haven't encouraged the planting of large trees either. And just travelling recently just reminded really, it was very stark. I mean, how older cities have done a really good job at holding on to big trees, and you really need them because cities heat up. And this is another conversation that's come through our council. How do we maintain temperatures within our built up areas? Trees do an amazing job at doing that. And as we were walking around with the family, you were trying to find places where you could be in the trees because it was just too hot to not be under the tree cover. And it was dramatically different. It felt like overseas jurisdictions have a very different view of how far away a tree needs to be from a footpath, from a road. And there was a whole lot of moves to have footpaths work around trees and have people walk around trees and not having to have everything in straight lines. And when a tree's in the road, we just remove it. And I think we have got a fair bit to learn there. So I'm interested in the best practice that we've looked at internationally about how others have dealt with that to end up with trees and preserve trees that are hundreds of years old in those civilizations where they have had hundreds of years of permanent encampment around those places. I think we cut down trees too frequently, and I often have members of our community come and complain about a tree that they believe is a nuisance, and I think we often give mixed messages, whether that's from different staff members or from different councillors about whether we should keep a tree or get rid of a tree and their personal opinion on the tree and whether they like the shape of the tree. So we need to provide, I think, more clarity to the community around what we believe is important to survive. And there can be multiple reasons and different excuses given for why a tree should stay or why it should go. And I think we need to, this work will actually help clarify some of that so we can, I think it's really good that we're having this conversation. You had a picture there of Castle Hill, and obviously they've had a problem with pest trees and conversation about how they come down. Equally, I think we need to have a conversation about how we just plant more trees and plant big trees that get to, not just 5 to 10 metres, but trees that get to 20 metres. And that brings in a different conversation about whether we are exclusively planting native trees in our spaces or whether there's actually just, we need any tree, we just need trees, and we're starting from such a deficit that actually just getting trees in is a good thing. And then once we get to the point where we are where we feel more comfortable with our tree canopy cover, then we can have a native conversation, or whether we want to have that right now at the beginning as we start this process and think about the types and species of trees that should be put in place. Other than, I think it was probably maybe just before the last election, we had a conversation here about beautiful streets. And we got asked to describe the beautiful streets. Most people described streets with trees along them, and so there's not just the temperature and the biodiversity that trees provide, but there's also the aesthetics that people like to live along. That can sometimes be challenged by people who move next door to a big tree and then realise how much shade that tree gives. And so this policy, I think, also needs to think about those instances. I also think that we should look at a community project, and whether that's part of this work or some further work, where we encourage the community to plant their own trees and berms outside their properties. And we set some criteria around what that should be. So we have a list of the trees that we are okay to plant, and so that is going to require some discussion. We have a minimum berm width that we say if it's smaller than this, then that berm's not the right place to plant a tree. So it's the right tree for the right place, as you've talked about. We give some guidance on how trees need to be planted. But I know a lot of people that would like to see more trees planted and often thinking about what could happen on their berm. And it doesn't have to come at a cost to council, because I think people would actually wanting to do this planting and get on with it. I think that what council could offer, though, is access to our purchasing power to provide these trees, and whether we just had a voucher system that could be sent out with some guidance to the community that says you can buy your tree at this place, you'll be able to access this discount and get on and plant it over the next 3 seasons. We've got nearly 40,000 rateable units. Imagine if we could get 50,000 trees planted in our townships across the district over the next 3 planting seasons. I think we need, it's good to review where we're at with the policy, but I also think we need a step change in our approach to encourage tree planting in our communities beyond just the reserves and the large gatherings of native plantings, which we've traditionally done, which are excellent and great. Let's think about how we actually transform our town and green them up with trees. And some of that's in our power and control, and that's where berms are. Some parts in our townships aren't, and where there's a state highway running through the middle of your town, there's other things to consider. But most of our towns don't have those, and I think we've got a big opportunity to see some change. So those are my views. I really appreciate this coming to us now, and I think we need to do more for trees, cut them down less often, as I've said, and do more to encourage community planting of trees. There's lots of other views around the table though. Elizabeth.
Hi, a bit like Sam, I've got quite a lot here, so shall I just keep going and you can pause me, put your hand up and pause me if you want to. So I'd like to know if there is already considered a way for communities to do some kind of snap, send, solve type approach to identify trees for protection and or evaluation, whether that's pruning, replanting, etc., etc. Communities of interest.
Should we just answer that and just then, okay. Is there advice to community on how they should do that stuff? Do we provide it as independent shop provider?
So anyone can feel free to come to the help desk or call the helpline, lodge a snap, send, solve, or form an email through our reserves department to get a tree issue resolved, depending on what they're after.
Right. Great. Okay. Is there also community of interest that will be able to be informed in the same way that roadworks is for major tree removals, but also an avenue to comment on designated tree removal? Because I have noticed that there's sort of sometimes you get the one neighbour who says, right, I want all these trees gone, but that whole community hasn't, given that. So I think that's something we need to identify. So
that's part of today's conversation, Elizabeth. We could have your views for the team at the front. Do you think that we should be protecting trees, or do you think that we should, should there be greater consultation? What's your?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Is if there is going to be tree removal, that we need to have a process so that those affected communities of interest have that ability to speak to that. So we're not taking just one person's advice. Will our tree policy have an aspect on planting fruiting or shade trees? Because these are often requested by submitters. Some trees only have a numbered life expectancy. So we do have some amazing trees, but they are limited in their lifetime. Are we looking at offering protection for those trees for a certain amount of time so that we sort of had a policy around that? A new approach to footpaths, tree roots. Well aware that tree roots are one of the big problems for footpaths. Are we able to look at providing solutions to those and being really creative with this, whether it's things like cutting up the concrete so the tree roots can have breathable space just within that area, that range, and then putting down something like gridlock mats with crusher dust so you've still got an even flat pathway? Thanks.
Any comments on those questions, Jane?
Thank you, Councillor Munn. I'll try and work through those. I think I've got main points down. So you'll remember when we were at Lincoln, for the public engagement on Waikirikiri Kitua Future Cell, when we heard about some of those individual tree decisions where it's affecting someone because it's on their street outside them and they had no knowledge that it was going to be removed, or even just some pruning, some maintenance. So we do clearly need to communicate with our communities more about those tree decisions, because it's really emotive and people are really invested in those trees. They're special, intergenerational, and we've heard that at the public forums. The current tree policy has a process to determine if it passes a threshold of significant public interest to have consultation, but the policy has been really unclear and difficult to follow. We've got two things called the tree policy, for example. So clarifying that and having the parameters for what triggers the public consultation process for those tree works is the intention of updating the policy. So there's already meant to be a process, but we want to make it clearer. That's one. Fruit or shade trees, that's an interesting question, something that we're going to have to hear from our communities on. There's no direction in the tree policy. It talks about the right tree, right place, right function, but there's going to need to be some further work, probably through our blue-green network work as part of Waikirikiri Kitua Future Cell, and to talk about what some of the right species are in the right context and circumstances, particularly around natives, which we've got a biodiversity crisis and we want more natives, but exotics provide more canopy cover, so there's a challenge there in how we strike the balance between what we plant. There's some more work to be done on that. I think as this is an interim update of the tree policy to make sure that we're getting the best tree decisions until we can go away and do further work on the canopy cover surveys to know about the distribution and about the different species types as well. The life expectancy question is really interesting. Part of the Christchurch's urban forest plan, for example, is about getting diversity in the species type, but also around different ages and different heights, so that we have to start thinking of trees as assets and thinking about we don't want all our trees to come offline at the same time, and we do need to have that kind of rolling stock of different ages, different heights. So that's something that we do want to look into. That's a really good point. I might pass on the protection of trees and those new innovative approaches for what we do about mature trees' roots to Mason, because he's got a little bit more experience in that. Some new techniques for dealing with tree roots and paved
So I've
surfaces.
been doing some work, not personally, but gathering some information from colleagues in the field about different footpath construction alternatives, because currently we have conflicts between root heave and footpaths, and so we need to be more diverse in our decision making, looking at different ways of either providing a bridge across the roots, using different products. So I've just been gathering that information, and we're going to start trialling some of those methods soon to try and preserve some of the trees rather than cutting them down because of footpath damage.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Sophie.
Thanks for the work that's been done on this. And thanks, Elizabeth, for your questions. Very pertinent. I have a question, and I guess it's around when we have trees, deciduous trees, and you mentioned about the fruit trees. Well, there's the rotten apples. We've got some of our heritage towns that have been around for a long time, got oaks and walnuts, and they, in a wind, being deciduous, suddenly all the walnuts or the oak seeds will end up in somebody's garden and somehow have to be sort of initiatively captured. I know of one tree that's planted on a council reserve, and it's next to Liffey Lifestyle, and nets have been used to actually try and capture in the fall to stop all the acorns from actually hitting all the houses. It's a case of a subdivision being allowed to plant or to grow too close to some heritage trees. It's happened now, it's there. They are protected trees, but just some understanding of how we're going to resolve some of our existing issues that we actually have to preserve some of these trees without the pressure of, wanting to cut down a perfectly healthy tree. The other area that I'd like some discussion on is I'm aware of past history where healthy trees have actually been cut down and been told that they are diseased. And it's only been when they've been cut down that they've realised that they've been perfectly healthy trees. So I know it's a bit of a debate, but how many arborists do you actually need to come along and assess a tree? Is it one or is it two? To give an opinion on what consists of a healthy tree, and I guess who's paying for that information might influence a decision on what's healthy. This is what's tend to happen in the past, and some of the other trees too is we need to concentrate on what is a healthy tree and what isn't a healthy tree, because the last thing you want is to put arborists and people at health and safety risk trying to preserve trees, that are totally unsafe, that need to come down. So it's all around that assessment criteria of what is a healthy tree and what isn't a healthy tree. And I suggest that maybe looking at the Christchurch plan, it probably needs some updating in that respect. So I just want to clarify that. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Councillor Hassan. I think those are probably some points that we're going to have to go away and do the work on. Really appreciate the first point around, as that seemed to be touching on the right tree, right place, right function, and clearly that's not happened. And the legacy issue of not the trees that we will plant, but dealing with our current tree assets, what we do about those. So we need to go away and do some work on that in terms of maintenance and any requests for any nuisance or trees causing problems like that. The healthy tree criteria, like one of the things that we discussed with the urban forest manager at the city is they had in their policy protect and retain mature trees, and he advised us, well, something that they would have added if they could is retain and protect healthy, mature trees. So that health consideration, the condition of the tree needs to come in more, and we're working with Mason and others on establishing some criteria for that. We haven't got it in front of you today because we're still doing the drafting, but that's something we will focus on and we'll make sure that we bring up when we bring the tree policy back to everyone.
Thanks, Deborah. Sophie.
Yeah, thank you very much, gentlemen. And yeah, I think this is one of those things that we probably haven't, I'm going to take a stab in the dark and guess that trees in general have been a bit of an afterthought in many areas, and it's probably something that we haven't resourced well enough or thought hard enough about for a very long time. So really welcoming this. Yeah, and trees are, like you said, when we think about beautiful streets, we often think about trees. Totally get that. There's definitely a welfare aspect to it, but there's also the whole ecosystem services type thing, and there's costs to that, like trees, or if you have fruit trees. Unfortunately, one big issue, I think it was Seville, they planted a whole bunch of orange trees, and then they realised the next summer that, oh no, that means we have oranges dropping to the ground that nobody's picking up, and now we have rats. So right tree, right place, right function, totally. Yeah, so you've already mentioned about trees that damage assets, so I'm not going to ask about that again because that was one of my questions. It's really frustrating when you see a really lovely gum tree, but then you realise that your footpath underneath it is now inaccessible because the roots are just popping up everywhere. So that's, yeah, something to be managed, and obviously you're well aware of that. The question that I had was around, in terms of potentially in section 4, I guess, there are some areas, for instance, in Rolleston, where you can see that on private land, which nobody really wants to touch, but it's the sort of, there are some large sections still within this town that have some quite decent wooded areas. And, you know, I sit there and I look over the fence and think, one day you're going to sell that section and somebody's going to bolt a whole lot. And just wondering if there's any chance or any way that we can think around, you know, we mentioned around asset bonds for people doing maintenance. Can we do something to preemptively say, like, when you're going to, yeah, if you choose to develop this one day, we would like to incentivize this to be excluded from any development plan, or we want it designated a reserve now, because those mature trees will take another 100 years to regrow. And the benefits could still be there straight away for whoever lives on whatever gets developed on that section. So yeah, I don't know quite how legally that is possible given that it is private land, but it would be fantastic to think about it, because yeah, once they're gone, they get churned up, they get turned into mulch, and that's it. And suddenly we've got to plant trees and maintain them all over again, and all those animals need to find somewhere else to be. It's a bit daft. And in the meantime, I'd also like to put it out there, we've got a whole bunch of small reserves in this area that are too small to kick a football around. You can't even send your dog for a walk. Basically, they're just a mowing contract. So if anybody wants to do some planting days on tiny, useless reserves around Rolleston, I will happily try and gather as many people as possible to turn them into something useful that could be shady one day rather than just a mowing contract. Yeah, got it.
On the last point, that sounds really lovely. I'd love to live in a town filled with microforests. Sounds fantastic. The the point that Ryan alluded to earlier, where we are diverging from Christchurch City and Queensland Lakes' policy, is our experience of greenfield development, and what we've heard from that team, particularly some of the development engineers and people looking at the landscape plans, is the opportunity to have those trees in a private lot that are going to be subdivided, where possible, incorporated into the into public ownership. So whether there's going to be a reserve or the road reserve rather than our green spaces, because we have a lot more control around public trees than we do private trees. So where we're diverging from the other policies is our experience of more greenfield development, and where we could get some better outcomes by encouraging developers to retain healthy, mature trees and have them in public ownership, so they become a public good. And that's one of the most novel things of all the tree policies across the Motu at the moment that we're looking at. But it will be something around reserve credits to encourage that rather than requiring it. So we're going to encourage, incentivise. And the private trees question in general is something that we'll want to look at quite in a detailed way through our Blue-Green Network work with the Greater Christchurch Partnership and as part of like Key to a Future Selwyn. But the policy does concentrate on council trees, but we acknowledge that our urban forests and our trees don't care about boundaries or tenure. So that's, yeah, we're thinking about that, Councillor McInnes. Thank you.
Are you making it explicit this is urban trees, not just all trees? The challenge, some of the newer staff might not recall, but we did have a policy around shading of roads, and it's explicit that we didn't want any trees in a road reserve at all in a rural environment, because we were having significant problems with frost, not lifting off roads, around drainage issues, particularly with trees and drains. We've had issues that trees that have fallen down in road reserves where the owners have said it's the council's problem to resolve because it's in the road reserve. So those things in the rural context, particularly significant issues. And I think my understanding of the current policy, or the policy that was put in place when we talked about it, when that policy was got rid of, was that there would be no permission for any trees to be in rural road reserves at all. It would be by exception rather than by allowance. So, and my understanding is that that's been reasonably rigorously enforced in that space. Does that align with what you guys at staff level are thinking?
No, that I wasn't aware of that. The current reading of the tree policy is it applies to council. It applies to trees on council land. It doesn't make an urban-rural distinction. And that's the existing policy. So, but we were aware that there are different circumstances in urban and rural environments that this tree policy needs to be agile enough to apply to both, as it currently applies to both from its plain and ordinary reading. But I wasn't aware of that. That's something that we could probably
that was the really real concern when that policy was disestablished, that we would end up in this position, and because you start to see it sometimes is that farmers are a bit canny. They don't want a tree on their side of the fence because it takes up their valuable land. They'd rather put the tree in the road reserve, and has a whole lot of negative effects and unintended consequences. So I would suggest you definitely need two policies, and you need to be explicit. If you go up, particularly in the Melbourne district, there's a lot of large-scale hedges on both sides of roads which never see the light of day in winter, which are significant danger to actual car traffic.
If I could just respond to your question, Councillor, I would probably argue that a lot of the trees on road reserves are probably inappropriate for the site, and probably
that's the thing. It's the right tree in the right place. That's the key thing.
And I think going forward, it's sort of identifying those pinch points on a case-by-case basis. And then if we do want to grow our tree canopy cover, looking at frangible species we can put in the road reserve, so they're not going to get to those heights. They're going to cause shading, and if they are hit by a car, they're not going to be frangible. They'll break up upon impact rather than being completely immovable. And I don't think council would have proactively planted a lot of those road reserves anyway. I think it would have been, as you say, farmers.
Well, that's the challenge. It's farmers who plant or the self-seeded. There's, particularly with those species that sucker and get into drains and sucker through the reserves, and inevitably ownership changes, and the perception is that they're council trees. The policy has been that in the rural sector anyway, any tree that's in a road reserve outside your property is your problem. With the council, if it falls over your fence and breaks the fence, that's your problem. It's not the council's. And this is significant cost implications. If we start to accept responsibility for rural trees on road reserves, you've got a hang of a problem on your hands. So I think you really need to be thinking about having two policies, a rural and urban tree policy. Particularly the notion of us empowering our ratepayers to just go and plant trees willy-nilly in our road reserves or our berms is very disturbing to me, because you've got a significant issue around what's under the ground, around infrastructure. Any tree that's planted in an urban berm should at least be the once over from our engineering team and assets team to make sure we're not planting on top of sensitive infrastructure. So while it's admirable to say let's go and let's empower people to plant trees, you're going to end up with the plethora, please. Again, the wrong tree in the wrong place is really damaging. So another thing, I heard some expressions of let's retain trees on private property. Absolutely against that. I mean, if I hear what you're saying, I enjoyed what you said, particularly about empowering that discussion when it gets done. But you shouldn't infringe on private property rights in the public space. Sure, not on private space though.
Yeah, much what Grant has said. As far as I'm concerned, like in Colgate, we had some people want to plant trees right around their property.
Sorry, Bob, I'll just stop you. Nicole is just joining us online. If we could just admit her to the meeting would be good.
Yeah, and people want to plant and they got permission from council. I wouldn't like to see that change, that people can plant willy-nilly wherever they like or whatever they like, and they got a consent from council to part 2 trees, and that's what we're ahead. But the other thing is protected trees. Have we got a list of them? And would that be available? Where can we find that? Because I'd be interested just in this areas that I look after to know which ones are.
Yeah, those, from my understanding, are in the district plan, but I can definitely get that information to you. So it has a schedule of all the protected trees.
Have you given any clarity for you thinking about where this what's next steps for this conversation? And like, is there going to be some community input to what we're discussing, or is it a council only conversation?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Mayor Bolton. I think that it will depend on the scale of the changes. We're still working through things. I think we've got a lot of things to go away and look at today from everyone's feedback and comments, so I really appreciate that. As looking at our neighbours, the Christchurch City Council tree policy went through a public consultation process, and that's where they got a steer on how people feel about having fruit and nut trees edible forests, or will there be problems about that, natives versus exotic. So they got a big steer from their community through that consultation process, and they found that there was general support for better tree protection. So we're hearing it around particular tree instances or from our communities and at public forums, but I think there would be value in hearing from our communities about these changes. But we'll look at what's proposed and what's different from the existing policy and see if it triggers that significance and engagement policy for a consultation. We will keep working through some of these things, but that might quite possibly how it comes back as a draft and seeking endorsement to go out for consultation on that.
It'd be quite good to have that conversation with the community ahead of the draft, just to get some input, so we're not just saying yes or no to the things that we're asking, but to seek that feedback before we go out, if that's possible. Great. Elizabeth?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to raise a point on what Sophie talked about with Seville and the oranges. There's a big movement for foraging in food forests, and I think one of the things that we don't have is we don't have a really good organised space. So I think if we were going to do these plantings, that if we have the app available that people can then can utilise, and it's, locations, really easy to find, and it's predominantly about food foraging. I think that those sort of wasteful moments of fruit falling all over the ground won't be so prevalent, because there are a lot of people looking for those opportunities.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. There's some contentious trees in Dartford, the chestnuts that are opposite the primary school that neighbours don't like, and people don't like getting in their feet in the shade created. And yet every year when the chestnuts fall, there's families go out there to forage and find the chestnuts and enjoy picking them up. So it's, there's both views in the community, which is why I think it's important to try and collect community views ahead of council going out saying this is our draft stance. So, and that might be targeted to select community groups or townships that you think this has been a conversation to begin with. But thank you for bringing that today. Are you continuing on for the biodiversity stuff? We're changing teams now?
Yeah, changing of the guard.
Thank you. They both had Ben Beard's name against them, so. Great, welcome along. Thank you for the paperwork that we've been able to read ahead of time. Look forward to your presentation and the conversation. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, councillors, Sam and Sharon. Thanks for the opportunity to provide this support and update on Indigenous biodiversity. We are aware that we need to make sure that we keep you up to date with different projects that we've got going on, and so this is from the environmental team, Denise and Johanna and Derek Hayes as well. So it's sort of recognition of the mahi that the team's doing across the takiwā. So we've got some key project updates here that we're going to take you through, and hopefully that'll cover off a few questions if you're wondering what was going on with some of these projects as well. So just a reminder of our recently completed cell and biodiversity strategy. We've got 4 key goals in that, and they've got particular themes: working in partnership, identifying the state, and then statutory responsibilities around protection, supporting actions by landowners in our community to protect and restore, and then also encouraging and increasing the integration of Indigenous species and modified environments, including our urban spaces, managed waterways and lifestyle blocks. So I guess it's a good reminder, we've got this document, we'll keep on working to it, and yeah. Okay, so the first project we're going to let you know about is Tarere Kautuku, Yars Lagoon Restoration Project. So there's a photo of Yars Lagoon looking south. And I guess just a reminder, it's one of the most significant lowland wetlands in Canterbury. It's council land, it's about 80 hectares. It was a lagoon originally on the Araria River, Araria L2 River. And then over time it resisted getting turned into pasture and retained its wetland state. So it's a very cool place, and we're learning as we go. It's a very complex site and a complex project as well. So Denise is as the project manager of this project. So council received close to $800,000 of freshwater improvement fund funding, primarily for willow control at this site. And there's also co-funding from the Te Waihora Weed Strike Force, which DCAN and DOC funded, and then also Living Water, Trees That Count, and council is also investing in the site. And I guess going forward, monitoring of weed species and trying to avoid reinvasion is really important. And then post 2026, when the first stage of the project is complete, we'll also be looking at recreation opportunities within this area as well. So that could involve walkways and bridges and that sort of thing. And it's only 5 minutes from Lincoln, so by driving, so potentially it's going to be a really great recreation space as well. Now, the key focus for the project is weed control and primarily grey willow control. If we don't get rid of these grey willows, they're going to continually reinvade the margins of Te Waihora. So there's a really important function here to improve our site, but also to keep in mind that the fact that grey willow seeds can travel approximately 20 kilometres in the air, and so we do need to control them. So you'll see the light blue shading in this slide is showing where the grey willows have been controlled already by the contractors, and so they've made some really good headway. It is, as we said, it's a complex site, and a lot of the smaller grey willows have required that we keep on thinking about methodology and keep on evolving the project and involving our knowledge and around methodologies as we go on. And in recent contract discussions, the DOC's Te Waihora Weed Strike Force will take over the true left of the site in this current year. So they will take over the management of that site, and a very experienced team. Another key part of the project is pest control, and so we've got a lot of success with taking out rats and possums, and we'd expect to see the biodiversity flourish in that site, especially the bird species flourish in that site over the future years. And something Denise had been talking about was, that we arguably could be looking at doing it, and over time would be potentially reintroduction of native species like birds. There's also a planting project going on here. There's been really good numbers of plants put in, and then we've also done some rebattering on the waterways in the site, and you can see the one there in the middle with carrot species planted, and then also some manuka heavy plantings as well, which recreates the vegetation that was once there. And I guess the key thing here as well being that a lot of the site has this emerging layers of native biodiversity coming through it, and it's which is really cool to see. So it's restoring itself in many ways. There's significant botanical values at the site with plants that are now uncommon or rare in the ecological district, and so it's a journey of discovery. We're finding new species as we go along. And then we're also seeing podocarps starting to emerge here as well. And I guess the question is, where are they coming from? Possibly from Banks Peninsula, from the Port Hills. But I guess it's a reminder of the ability of sites like this to also restore themselves if we can help them, especially getting rid of the grey willow. And then it's also a living laboratory, and we've had a lot of interest in the site from universities, Lincoln and Canterbury, Lincoln High School, Enviro School's Boys Brigade are going to be doing a planting down there in the next few weeks. And also we've been looking at doing a Mātauranga Māori study there as well. So, I guess it sort of just shows the added value that we get with a site like this in terms of having our community involved in it and learning a lot as we go. So the next project that I'll update you on is the biodiversity monitoring program, and so we're the team, the environmental team, are developing a program where we'll look to work with landowners and managers to provide clarity around the new district plan objectives and rules. And I guess the basis of that is that under those new rules, that pretty much any changes in intensity of land use outside of current pasture is likely to be restricted discretionary and will also require a biodiversity management plan. So we've got a bit of a step change with our new district plan. So we want to work with our landowners, especially in the high country, on that. And then as part of that, we'll also be working with LINZ and UC, for instance, some of the significant landowners there. And as we always do, we'll also be providing support and advice and, around things like weed and pest control and fencing and that sort of thing to protect special areas. And then just a note at the bottom that this mahi, this program is consistent with the cell and biodiversity strategy goals and targets. So it's sort of backed by those goals and targets. Now, this is the Selwyn Natural Environment Fund, the SNEF fund, which you will all know about. So Johanna's going to talk about that now.
Sorry. Kia ora koutou. It's a little hard to read that white writing from here, but basically we've had a lot of interest in the Selwyn Natural Environment Fund this year. We've had over 51 applications for the latest funding round, and of that we've had 49 successful applicants. 33 of those projects are for restoration planting. We've got 9 for predator trapping, 6 for woody weed control, and 1 for fencing of native bush. So 7 of these approved projects are for work within confirmed significant natural areas. And then we've got 17 projects in areas that have really high existing biodiversity values. So the total amount in the 2024 SNEF fund is 258,000 when you include the GST, and we've allocated just over 200,000 of that. So we do actually have a little bit left over in that fund. However, we've already started receiving applications for some really worthwhile looking projects. So we'll likely be having another round of decisions for that fund coming up. Just to cover off give a couple of examples of projects that we've been supporting. For example, we have Scott and Amy in Taitapu who began planting around 5 years ago with Te Arakakariki, and they've been continuing that off their own backs. They've now planted a really extensive area of their property right around the perimeter, and they're continuing to work and maintain that. I went and visited recently and the plants are doing super well. So we've just been continuing to support that purchase of plants basically, and they're doing all the labour and maintenance. Another SNEF recipient is some landowners along the Hey stream just near Southbridge. This is a significant natural area along the waterway there. There's some amazing stands of existing big cabbage trees, flax, threads and sedges. So the landowners have been clearing a lot of woody weeds out of that area. They've also received some funding through the Rakaia
Catchment Environment.
Rakaia Catchment Environmental Fund, so that's Manawa Energy. So they've cleared a lot of the willows out of that area and have been underplanting with further ecosource natives.
We're just going to flick. Okay, thanks, Sam. So I guess the key thing with these projects is showing how we work in partnership and ideally get some good results. So the Rakaia Gorge Weed Control Partnership, I think any time you drive across the Rakaia Gorge, you can see the significant biodiversity that's present there, and you know it's a special site where the plains hits the foothills, and so it's got a pretty special assemblage of native plants there. So it's got high ecological values. It's possible that some areas may have missed fires in the past, and so it's there's also quite a few threatened and at-risk species. Project partners are the landowners, and including Terrace Downs, who have been very active in the project. LINZ, Ashburton District Council, ECAN and STC. So it's, you know, we're all working closely together. We've got a variety of funding coming in from Manawa Energy and LINZ, landowners, and then ECAN has also put quite a lot of money into this project along with, and then ADC and Selwyn are supporting that. There's also been MPI and ECAN-led pine control here. And it's and we based the initial project on an ecological report done by Di Robertson, who did an assessment of the weeds present and also some of the native values. Not surprisingly, the key weed species are sycamore, cherry, cotoneaster, pines, and most of them have escaped from the early homesteads in that area. And then as a note, Robbie from Quickenberry in Terrace Downs, amazing chef, by the way. he's also doing some pest control in that space as well, so that sort of ties in nicely with our project. So, and then we've got a variety of stages here. We've just completed stage 1, which is a green shading on the map. Stage 2 is purple shading, which is where we're moving into, and then we see stage 3 in just over 2 years' time. We'll be more monitoring and mopping up of established weeds and new incursions. So, like with Tariri Kautuku, we acknowledge that we're going to need to manage these sites into the future. There's no we don't go and invest in it and then walk away from the sites. And we're also wanting to understand more about the exact biodiversity that actually exists in the gorge as well, so learn more about what we're actually protecting. Another key partnership is Upper Waimakariri Basin. So as you drive up through the Upper Waimakariri, you may well notice a proliferation of weeds up there. There's also some obviously some amazing native vegetation as well. So WIRT, which is the Waimakariri Environmental Recreation Trust, they initiated this project. We've got a bunch of partners involved, and that also involves Kiwi Rail, UC, Waka Kotahi, Department of Conservation. BOFA Miskell prepared an Upper Waimakariri strategy that guides us in our work, and the idea is to create a less ad hoc and more integrated project, and the strategy helps guide that. Key weed species, holly, hawthorn, sycamore, Spanish heath, and then we've got a picture of the strategy here, and then also some mapping showing some work that's been done in the beech forest behind Grasmere Station, and so really concerning where the holly is actually getting into the beech forest, and if we don't get onto it now, we don't know where it would finish. So not an easy weed to control, but we are working at it, and ECAN especially are taking the lead on that particular piece of work. So. And then we're just going to skip into predator control projects. So Joe's going to talk about that.
Yeah, so we have a little bit to do in the predator control space, mainly working with a lot of other organisations and community groups. So Denise has been representing Council on the project managers group for Pest Free Banks Peninsula and also the Waitaha Pest Free Steering Group. As of this year, we will be establishing the Predator Free Fund, which is a new fund of $50,000 contestable for landowners and community groups to apply to. So that's really exciting. It will just help us to support more people with protecting what they've got and getting rid of the predators. We've been supporting predator-free groups within the district, including Trap Libraries in Darfield, West Melton and Kirwee, as well as existing groups such as Craigieburn Trapping Alliance and Pest Free Banks Peninsula again. And there's some real champions out there too. That picture of Dave Tilson, he does amazing work down near Taumotu on farmland, down on the wetland around the marae, and working in with various groups to eliminate possums and mustelids.
Now, as a key outcome of the Southern Biodiversity Strategy, forming the Biodiversity Working Group is something that we're working on at the moment, and the idea with that is to have a Biodiversity Working Group that helps to inform our work program going forward. So ideally, we've got a work program that's informed by our community. So we'll be looking at developing 3 yearly biodiversity work programs, which will align with the LTP processes, and it'll help to lead the implementation of the Southern Biodiversity Strategy. We also want it to be a conduit for relation building between council and landowners and the general public. At the moment, Denise is working with engaging with the potential working group members to start asking them about their interest and involvement in this, and we would aim to have our first meeting before the end of the year, and you'll see a bit of a list there, obviously with Te Taumutu being the key partner, involved here, and then also the likes of QE2, universities, Forest and Bird, Te Ata Kakariki, and Ellesmere Sustainable Agriculture. And now we flick down to community projects.
Yeah, so obviously a key part of what we do involves a lot of community engagement. We're not working in isolation from our community. So there's a lot of engagement through the Selwyn Natural Environment Fund, through the weed and pest control projects. And yeah, there's a lot of site visits, meeting with landowners and community groups, providing advice and assistance where needed. Also, got our strategic partnerships with Te Ara Kakariki, the Summit Road Society, Waihora Ellesmere Trust, and the Lincoln Envirotown, as well as supporting Kids Discovery Plant Art Days and just general biodiversity inquiries as they come in via emails and whatever method, phone calls, etc. So there's a lot of back and forth in advising to community-led initiatives and trusts. And then alongside that, obviously, we've got the internal council engagement. So working quite closely at times with the reserves team, the properties team, communications, consents, compliance, reviewing resource consents as they relate to biodiversity matters. And then also leading events such as biodiversity walks, planting days. There's been some library events looking at how to use iNaturalist, for example. So just trying to engage with the community in as many ways as possible to, just really bring biodiversity to the foreground and help people out as much as possible through our work.
Thank you. And also, thanks to your support around the table for biodiversity. We've as you can see, we've got a lot of good projects going on, and that wouldn't be happening without having the support around the table to allow us to make it happen.
Okay, thank you both. Elizabeth.
Just a couple of things. Yars Lagoon, talking about putting in walkways and bridges and things. There's no concern about those getting washed out in a severe flood during a winter? And the pest control count that you had for Yars Lagoon, I was just wondering if that's for a year? That was, I can't remember which page it is, sorry. Do we have, one of the things that would be quite cool, because you've just talked here about all the ways that you've been engaging, there's always a couple of factors that always come up that the community sort of have trouble with, and one is keeping plantings alive. Like, it'd be great to just sort of have something that's really easy point of call where people go, okay, this is what's successful, this isn't successful, that are learned by those who are doing this all the time. It'd be kind of nice for us to see feedback as well on some of the where the money's gone and how successful or unsuccessful they've been with certain things, because there's always going to be some fails for startup projects. And obviously things like predator solutions. These people who are doing the trapping all the time, rats, I've found, get very smart about how traps work, and so you guys must be seeing how you're having to change things for rat behaviour. It'd be really cool to just have some feedback that we can share to the wider the community, because for us rural folks, rats are a huge issue.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yes, absolutely agreed about the pests, and I think the methodology is getting better all the time. Certainly, we see the need to help work with our community and our community groups that are doing the trapping projects, and help inform them as things change over time. And with Taririka Tuku, definitely agreed about the recreation assets that they would need to be. We'd need to consider flooding. Luckily, the floods through that area generally move pretty slowly, but yeah, we'll have to take that into account. And I think the pest numbers are over the life of the project up to date. So there's about 2.5 years of data there.
Thank you, Phil.
Forest restoration versus predator control versus weed control. Obviously, they're all of them together. when you're determining the funding for those, is there a priority that you look at? Is one slightly more favourable than the other, or what do you think?
So within the funding criteria, we do prioritise work initially for within significant natural areas is the top priority, and then the second level of priority is for areas that have existing native biodiversity. So that protection level, often like weed control if you have an established forest, the values, basically the maximisation of the money is so much better when there is existing biodiversity, but obviously recognising that a lot of the plains doesn't have any. So then the third tier of funding is for restoration planting.
Okay. Okay. So between pest control and forest restoration, there's not one over the other?
No, I wouldn't say so. Though it will change a little with this new predator control funding, because that will automatically go onto the new fund.
Which is actually my next question. This is for Sharon. The predator-free fund and the Selwyn Natural and Environment Fund, are they part of that contestable fund that that committee we talked about earlier on today considers? Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Grant.
Two questions. First one's about Yarrs Lagoon. Obviously, the government money's going to run out for the willow control. We all know how hard they're out of control once you stop those control measures. I wondered whether there was any idea of forming a community working party who were going to continue the good work unpaid after this, because things like the Summit Road Society and those, you do get a lot of passionate volunteers, the Sticks Living Laboratory. There are a lot of people out there who are really keen on using their spare time to maintain these public access areas. Is that part of your thinking, to get it going while there's money there, rather than wait till the money runs out and then go, oops, we've got a hole here, we're not going to be able to sustain getting, particularly this, as you say, the wee suckers and small seedlings out? That's the first question.
Yeah, absolutely, Grant. I think that we had, as when we wrote a reserve management plan for Taririkau Tuku about 4 years ago, we did form a land care group around that. So we are re-engaging with that land care group to have them involved. So that's a way for the community to be involved in the project and help make work with some of the decision making around it. And then I guess, yeah, what you're describing as well is very much like what Denise has been involved in at Travis Wetland, where there's been huge success over the years, and that's been very much led by the community. And so, yeah, we'd certainly see that approach going forward.
Particularly where we've got paid employees that could train and show the volunteers how to control and how to use it safely would be a good way of using some of that spend. The second question is around the Selwyn biodiversity strategy. Hopefully that's linked closely to the One Water strategy. Is there really clear linkages there? I mean, because part of the One Water strategy was thinking about biodiversity, particularly around our waterways and things like that. Do they overlap? Are they joined together? Do you talk?
The linkages would be relative to our to where we've got and our goals, targets, actions, where we refer to waterways and especially modified waterways and that sort of thing, and where we want to target some activities in the future. There isn't a particular link between the two strategies. I guess they were being written concurrently, but what we are doing is working closely with Te Committee, and so the teams involved in those meetings with Te Committee where the catchment management plans are being developed. So we want to be very much involved in that discussion going forward, bearing in mind that there's some good funding in that space to create some good actions into the future with our waterways.
That's probably an emerging theme that I'm seeing, with my other hat on, is moving to more macro, looking at the whole catchment and saying where's the best bang for buck and what is the 100-year vision, and how does what we're doing today contribute to that 100-year vision, rather than putting a little dot here and a little dot there. Is that little dot a part of the bigger vision, which it may not be? And I think that's important that we use that macro vision, probably for those at catchment scale.
Yeah, absolutely agreed, and that's I guess the Araria catchment, L2 catchment, and with the work that Living Water did there with producing a catchment management plan is key for that, and then also the other managed catchments around Te Waihora, and also I can see the Te Waifio Urwell catchment is probably one that's missing out at the moment, so I can see that clearly needs a catchment approach into the future.
Thanks for the presentation. One of the maps you had was working the Rakaia and was on the Ashburton side of the river. Just wondering about Ashburton's part in partnering with you on that work.
Good question, Sam. I guess Ashburton is they're taking steps more deeply into biodiversity management, and Christian, who works there, is leading that. And so initially their work was specifically around the campground and where they're taking trees out and planting, done some native plantings, but now they also have funds available for activities, especially around the walkway that's been created on the south side of the gorge. So they're sort of getting more involved in providing some funding towards the project as well. So, but I guess it's it's a good example of where when we're doing the mahi and ECAN and landowners, then it sort of draws Ashburton, ideally draws them into the project and into the conversation as well.
Thank you. Cheers for the update today. I think it's the end of the questions. We appreciate the briefing. Ta. Next up, we've got Emma Larson and Robert Love. Public consent notices requiring development to previous district plan standards in area originally consented under HASHA and COVID fast-track consenting processes. Is the title. I'll just note, often when we are developing or talking about situations that affect a township that one of us might live in, that's really obvious because we know where we live. This area is in Rolleston, and my conflicts of interest register has identified that I own a property in this area, but I just thought the meeting should be aware of that as well before we have the discussion. There's many properties affected by this, but I think that it's important that you know that I have one of those.
Kia ora. I've been asked to brief you today on this issue around consent notices that are applied to large areas of Rolleston, and they are in relation to subdivisions that were consented through the various iterations of fast track legislation that that developers have been able to use. So there's the Housing Accord and Special Housing Areas Act and COVID-19 Recovery Fast Track Consenting Act, and I've included a plan at the back of the report that shows sort of the areas that we're talking about. It totals about 2,000 lots, and so that, it's reasonably significant. And so because when these areas had their subdivision consents issued, they were still zoned rural, and so we had to make sure that these sites would be developed in accordance with the existing residential form, and at that time it was the Living Z zone under the operative district plan. So each of these properties in these areas have ended up with a consent notice on the title saying that the development of these lots needs to comply with the rules and requirements for the Living Z zone of the previous district plan, which was good at the time when it was still zoned rural, but since then, through our district plan review process in variation 1, each of these areas have now been upzoned to medium density residential, which is quite a different set of bulk and location standards. So you'll recall that medium density residential standards were intended to enable 3 dwellings of 3 stories in height on each residential lot, whereas the Living Z was 1 dwelling per site, maybe up to 2 stories if you had enough space. So it's quite different. And the issue that we have is that because they're consent notices on the title, they apply to each individual title, and the landowners for those sites have to comply with that consent notice. So the way that we've been dealing with this is that just on a case-by-case basis, if someone has a site in one of these areas and they want to do something that doesn't comply with the old plan standards, they have to apply to vary their consent notice. They might have to get their neighbour's approval, and we just consider those on a case-by-case basis. The advantage of that is the the person that's benefiting from the cancellation of the consent notice is paying for it, and there's sort of reasonable certainty for neighbours as to the reason that the consent notice was applied in the first place. But obviously the frustration is that we've since zoned MRZ, which anticipates a different standard of development, and if you were a landowner wanting to develop to that standard, then you have to go through an extra step of essentially applying for a resource consent to change the consent notice. So that's how we're dealing with it at the moment on a case-by-case basis. I guess there's other options for dealing with it. One of the options that we've considered is just ignoring the consent notices. We thought that was quite a clever interpretation, but our legal advice is that that's not legally defensible. So unfortunately, we probably won't go with that one. The other option is for the council to initiate the cancellation of these consent notices across all of the areas affected. So what that would involve is essentially making a resource consent application to cancel the consent notices. We've kind of considered how this would roll. We'd probably have to do some pre-application consultation with all of the people potentially affected. So that's 2,000 lot owners plus probably the surrounding landowners, so ones adjoining, they have an expectation or might have an expectation that it's a lower density of development anticipated for these sites. And then we would have to lodge an application. I think we would be sensible to request public notification to give everyone involved the opportunity to make a submission. If there are submissions, there'd be a hearing, and then the commissioner or panel of commissioners would make a decision. And then that decision would also be subject to appeal. So I guess on the one hand, the consent notices sort of frustrate the development to MRZ standard. On the other hand, there might be a lot of landowners that appreciate the one dwelling per lot kind of traditional Rolleston density of development and may be opposed to cancelling the consent notices. So we're kind of proposing that we continue with the way that we're dealing with it on a case-by-case basis, but I just wanted to add that there's another kind of element to this, in that with the kind of direction that's coming from central government, and that is that we may have a choice around whether we continue to apply the medium density residential standards, and we don't know exactly what that looks like at the moment. We've kind of, the word that's coming out from central government is that the council will be asked to ratify the continued application of medium density residential standards, but at this stage there's nothing written, there's no legislation, there's no sort of anything formal. So until we exactly know the question we're being asked, it's hard to know what we would do. But we think that maybe having a conversation with these communities affected by the consent notices now may be better to have in conjunction with that conversation that we may have to have with them about whether to continue with the medium density residential standards across the urban areas in Selwyn. So, or whether, there's a number of things that could happen there. We could roll it back in some areas, but continue with it in areas, say, close to the town centre or on public transport routes, that sort of thing. So until we kind of know what that is, maybe we could, my recommendation would be to defer doing anything specific about this on a 2,000 lot wide scale until we know sort of what direction we might be heading in that regard. So.
Cool, thank you for the update. Oh, Sharon.
Yep, thank you, Emma, and thank you for articulating that. The reason why we brought this briefing paper forward to you is because we've had a number of community concerns raised. And as you see from some of the numbers that the team have been dealing with a number of these, and we've also had feedback from developers too, in terms of their frustration and perhaps why some of the developers are staying away from those particular areas. And so it's quite a topical conversation out there in the community, and again, in the spirit of, being public in a workshop and having open conversations with councillors to say, hey, these are some of the things that we're coming across, that this is what our particular challenge is. And I think, although we couldn't give an exact dollar at the moment, say, according to, Emma's suggestion, around their thought around initiating an application process. There would be a funding required associated with that could be considered quite considerable, possibly up to $250,000-300,000. And given what Emma has just advised around what's coming in the future, we don't see that would be a sensible approach at this moment in time, but just very aware that it is quite a topical conversation, and we wanted you as councillors to be aware of our rationale. And Bob made a very good point to me earlier on today that what we will also need to do, and part of our focus on customer service and service back into the community, is the engagement back into our community around what's happening and why. And I think I sent an email out maybe a month ago that recognises that we want to re-engage, and that means bringing the business sector back in regularly to meet with the staff and keep people up to date, the community and the business sector, so we explain why we're doing things, because we've not perhaps been doing that to the best of our ability over the last few years, and so we've got an opportunity to turn that around. And I think we've got our first meeting this month with the community, with the business sector.
Yeah, on the 17th, we've got a customer presentation about the current things that we're dealing with.
The current way you're doing it, I think she thinks about 13 so far, another 13 in the application. Is it expensive to do that? I mean, can we make it a template which is basically saying, well, it's slightly, there's a problem here, but let's make it as efficient and easy user-friendly as possible. Here's the template. It's going to cost you X to do it. It's only $500 or whatever it's going to be. And so it's more of an inconvenience rather than a major hoo-ha. Is that possible?
Yeah, we've made it as templatey as we can. We try and do that with all of our processes here. I think we can probably look at refining that further and perhaps assisting applicants with a template for them as well. Yeah, I think probably one of the more frustrating things is around where there's deemed to be affected parties. So it's often quite a big deal or a delicate process to go and ask your neighbours for affected party approval. So yeah, I think if we weren't doing that, it would be very straightforward rubber stamp, but well, not rubber stamp, but very quick. Sometimes some of the churn is around determining are there affected parties and discussions with the applicant around that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to say thank you for the update, because every so often you do hear a few things, living in Raleigh with people who want to develop their state, their areas and things. But also, I support your proposal of just sort of sticking with how we're going at the moment until we know more about how policies are likely to change, because there's actually not much, otherwise it's a waste of time and effort. And unfortunately, we've had this whole revolving door of policies and, but now do this and everything else. The more we can minimise engaging very busy people who just want to get on with stuff, and also, staff just having to deal with processing all this work as well. Yeah, it would be good to have some more definites before going out and trying to make some sort of wholesale change if one's needed at all. Yeah, thank you.
Hiya, kia ora. Look, if it wasn't for the government indicating that there's going to be changes, then I'd be saying this is just a balancing exercise to go, is it going to cost, how much is it going to cost the community individually, as opposed to how much it will cost council, and it will be a really easy decision to make just based on the numbers. But I'm halfway, this is my area of expertise, right in the middle of a hearing right now on Variation 1 that's been elongated because the government keeps changing its mind. So, and it's on medium density. So I think I agree with you to hold off and see what the government does, because that could actually resolve the issue. Yep.
Cool, thank you for the update today. Final topic of conversation in this briefing is was from Tim Harris. Tim is away to training at the moment. This is around ECAN's representation review. You've got in front of you the suggested submission. It's short, it's on a page. It supports the best representation for Selwyn in our communities on ECAN by doubling the amount of representation that we currently have. It closely aligns with the true population data for Canterbury as well, and in a fast growing area, the positive, we're moving from a big deficit into a slight positive. That positive over time will continue to be eroded away as we grow into it. Sophie had given a couple of suggested changes, which highlighted, Sophie, I'll get you to talk to your suggested changes, but it was about highlighting the options and actually talking about what was going on. So Sophie.
Yeah, my main suggestion was that, so on the page with our submission, which is really short, but points 5, 6 and 7 refer to option 3, which actually they aren't using that wording in their initial proposal at all. That was the initial one. Hey!
Tim is now with us. Thanks, Tim. I just gave a brief overview of the work that's on the page, and Sophie's the first speaker to it.
No, thank you, Sam. And I should say I haven't really been involved in any detail in terms of the preliminary submission, but you're quite right. I did look at that. I think this is the initial proposal. It's its formal title.
Yeah.
So that can be swapped out. So nothing's really changed from our first piece of feedback we gave ECAN, and I suggest that we just continue on with the same approach of supporting what ECAN are proposing. The only other thing I suppose to tick off is that I have reserved some space on the 18th of September at the hearing in the afternoon. I'm actually on leave at that stage, so it might be appropriate if Sam or someone else could be there to give our view at the hearing. But happy to try and answer any questions between myself and Sam. We should be able to get there.
Sophie, good. Continue with that.
Yeah, so, we've already mentioned about changing the wording that's there, and you've got the section that says option 3.
Yeah.
If we take that out and put what they've actually got in their initial proposal.
Yeah.
And the other suggestion I had was, and I don't know whether anybody else feels like this, is just going to ask, would it be worth throwing in a number 8 to say that we support ECAN's stance on their Ngāi Representation Act, which isn't part of the representation review, but it's just an opportunity to put it out there and so that we support them. Personally, obviously, I support them. I don't know what anybody else thinks. I'm just asking. Get it?
Thanks, Sophie. And that's consistent with the submissions that were given in the past to ECAN to support that decision. It would really be a note at the end of the submission rather than a submission to the representation review. Phil?
Just really quickly, just an observation on this, yes. It's really interesting how that managed to completely ignore the plus or minus 10%.
Yeah, I was quite surprised by that as well. The advice that we've received in terms of our own review, that was a fairly high bar to be able to get over, but they have done it. Looks like they did in the last one as well.
Yeah, ECAN's last model had, they initially went out with only one councillor for South Canterbury, and then they decided, based on public feedback, to have 2, which was well outside the plus or minus 10%, but on the geography of Canterbury, it was decided that was an important balance.
Did the Electoral Commission make any comment on that, or do you know?
It was one of the examples that was raised here with us, and the Electoral Commission, that's the Local Government Commission that looks at it, and they highlighted it, yes, as an example of there were a handful of councils that went outside the plus or minus 10%. I think they're mostly regional councils. Because of the scale of a region, you start to become 4 or 5 hours away from the centre of decision making. Great, something that gives some clarity on that. We'll get that away to ECAN.
Yep, no, thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone. We'll adjourn for lunch. Back at 1 p.m. Thanks, Nicole, online.